Good evening, everyone. On behalf of Delhi Liver Foundation, we welcome you to this series of webinars, especially on obesity. And this is the first on this series where we'll try to decipher why there's obesity. We'll try to understand obesity, and we'll try to define obesity. So there'll be a series of 4 to 5 webinars, and in the first of this series, we have panelists and moderators as Dr. Vivek Sarswat, Dr. S.P. Singh, Dr. Mandhir Kumar, and we have an eminent line of speakers, Dr. Setu Babu, Dr. Siva Prasad, Dr. Romesh Kardori, Dr. Anil Arora, Dr. D.N. Reddy, and Dr. Ghanani from Canada. But before going on to this webinar, we are here also to felicitate Dr. M.P. Sharma, the eminent gastroenterologist who has dedicated his life for gastroenterology for about 4 to 5 decades. He has been head of department of the AIMS, and for all his immense contribution in gastroenterology, we are here to give the late S.P. Sama Memorial Award. I'll briefly speak about Dr. S.P. Sama. I'll share my slides here. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can see you.
Yeah. So Dr. Surendra Kumar Sama, here's a tribute to him. He was born on 31st May 1934 at Firozpur. His initial schooling was at Government School, Bilaspur, Himachal Pradesh, and then he did his MBBS from Medical College, Amritsar. Subsequently, he joined All India Institute of Medical Sciences, Delhi for his MD Medicine, and he also received a WHO fellowship for training in gastroenterology from Tufts University in Boston, where he went there in 1970 and 71. He had a brilliant career. He started his career by joining his alma mater at AIMS, and then he stayed at AIMS till 1974, during which time he established the Department of Gastroenterology at AIMS, and he also established at the gastroenterology department at GB Pant Hospital. Then he subsequently joined Gangaram Hospital as honorary physician in 1976 and served there at Gangaram for 36 years, and he was also the chairman of Gangaram from 1995 to 2006. So while his association with Gangaram, he also founded his multi-specialty Sama Hospital in 1982. He was also a personal physician to the President of India in 2001. At Sir Gangaram Hospital, he founded the Department of Gastroenterology, and which has now grown to become a center of excellence and is known all over India as well as outside India. He held various posts at Sir Gangaram Hospital, including that of the founder member of the Board of Management, and was also a member of its Board of Trustees. He was chairman of Board of Management from 1995 to 2006. He was a teacher par excellence. He was an excellent teacher, and his devotion to academic remained till his last breath. And he was a role model for many medical students, including me, and for so many budding gastroenterologists. He was also a keen researcher, and he was a pioneer in medical field, especially in liver disease. He had published more than 50 high-impact articles in various international journals. His first article on non-cirrhotic portal fibrosis, which was published in 1962, is much quoted everywhere. He is also credited with significant research on hepatitis B, and he has always been inquisitive and had a zeal to learn latest techniques in gastroenterology. He had multiple contributions to medical societies. He was a former president and life member of Indian Society of Gastroenterology, and he organized multiple therapeutic endoscopy workshops. He was also a life member of the Indian Society of Liver Disease, Indian Society of Gastrointestinal Endoscopy, American Gastroenterology Association, and Association of Physicians of India. He was also the president of the New Delhi chapter of Indian Medical Association and board of advisors of the American Hospital Management Company. He had won multiple awards. He received the Government of India's COVID Padma Shri in 2004 for his pioneering research in liver disease, including NCPF and hepatitis B. He received the highest Indian medical honor, that is the B.C. Roy Award in 2004, and he was also recipient of several other awards like Punjab Ratan, Bharat Jyoti Award, Bhaskar Award, to name a few of them. He delivered several award lectures such as Presidential Oration, B.L. Kapoor Memorial Oration, Dr. K.L. Vig Memorial Oration, and R.S. Tiwari Oration. So he's also been considered as father of gastroenterology. He's the teacher of teachers, astute physician, and able administrator. So my heartful tribute to Dr. S.K. Sama. And this time we are giving the S.K. Sama Memorial Award to Dr. M.P. Sharma. So I would invite Dr. Mandhir Kumar to say a few words about Dr. M.P. Sharma. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Ashish. It's my proud privilege and honor to read a citation about Professor Mahesh Prakash Sharma. Professor M.P. Sharma has been a doyen of gastroenterology in India. He is an astute and outstanding clinician, a dedicated researcher, a committed teacher, and above all, a humble person and a very good human being. Professor Sharma, after receiving his training in gastroenterology at the All India Institute of Medical Sciences in 1970, worked as a fellow and clinical instructor at Lahey Clinic and Harvard Medical School, Boston, USA. Subsequently, he worked as faculty in Department of Gastroenterology at his alma mater, AIMS, for almost 30 years, starting 1975, and superannuated as head of the department in 2004. While at AIMS, he contributed significantly in the growth of AIMS by working in various committees, including the chairman of Hospital Management Board. Presently, he heads the Department of Gastroenterology and is member of advisory board at Rockland Hospital, New Delhi. He has been recognized for his contribution in clinical gastroenterology both at national and international levels. His areas of research include peptic ulcer disease, inflammatory bowel disease, and amoebic liver abscess, where his contributions are well recognized. He has 337 national and international publications to his name and has 50 chapters in various books. He is amongst the first gastroenterologists who popularized the use of bedside ultrasonography by a gastroenterologist. He has been conferred with numerous orations and awards, including K.M. Lal Oration, Boots Oration, Dr. C. Prakash Oration, Dr. V.N. Mishra Oration, Alembic Oration, M. Kasliwal Oration, Vasanti Devi Oration, and Nihal Marcus Oration. He has been a very accomplished academic leader and served many national societies and was a president of Indian Society of Gastroenterology, Indian Federation of Ultrasound, and vice president of Geriatric Society of India. It's an honor to know you, sir, and we are very happy to confer this award upon you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Arora.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mandhir Kumar, for such kind words about me. It's a pleasure and honor to receive this award in the memory of Dr. S.K. Sama. It's very interesting to know that I was with Dr. Sama when I was doing my DM in gastroenterology and also registrar in gastroenterology at AIMS. And also, I am so lucky because my first two papers which I have published in a reputed journal was with association with Dr. S.K. Sama. One was peptic ulcer disease, which I continued to work till the end, and also the second was on parasitic disease. These were two contributions which he helped me and we published first time. He was also very keen researcher. In 1970, there was an epidemic of viral hepatitis in patient of that for every one case, there were 8 to 10 cases of anectic hepatitis, which was published. And the most important thing is, after the survey, We all used to go down to his house where he used to give us So I'm again privileged and also thankful to all of you who have bestowed me this award in the memory of Dr. Sama, who was a great friend of mine. Thank you.
Dr. Arora, you are muted. Dr. Arora, kindly unmute. Yeah.
Okay. Can you hear now?
Yeah.
We can hear you,
Yeah.
Dr. Yes.
Thank you, Professor Sharma. It was a pleasure to have you on board. I think it is a proud privilege to have somebody who has really started the field of gastroenterology in private practice. We're privileged to have you, somebody who has propelled the field of gastroenterology, at least in North India. With that, we come to the end of the formal presentation ceremony and we move on to the presentation of the day. The topic is pathogenesis, unraveling the mystery of obesity, the pathogenesis of obesity. What we had decided was that since obesity is a big topic in itself, we have divided into 5 different parts. First is the pathogenesis, second is the definition of obesity, and subsequent to the gut hormones and endoscopic therapy, etc. With that, I'll hand over the proceedings to our respected chairpersons, Professor Shiv Prasad Singh and Dr. Vivek Saraswati.
Yes,
Can you hear us? Yeah. Dr. Singh?
yes.
Yeah.
Good evening. It's a great pleasure to welcome all of you to this wonderful seminar. So without much ado, I think we start with the first talk of the evening. Am I audible, Dr. Arora?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Right. So, and to deliver this talk on define obesity, we have none other than Dr. Setu Babu. As you can see in the pictorial cartoon on your screens, he is having a go around with Dr. Anil Arora on this in picture. Dr. Setu Babu is a highly and is one of the most vocal and articulate speakers we have in gastroenterology. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome Setu. And could you please go ahead and we'd like to hear you on how genes define obesity, Dr. Setu Babu?
Yeah, I don't know whether I should thank Anil for this wonderful opportunity. And the question is, do genes define obesity? And the $1,000,000 question is, why people become, overweight? And is there a role of genetics? When we do not know in any cause, we just say everything could be genetic, and this is such a tough subject. And I don't know, Anil has hit me really saying that do it. So I think the moment we speak obesity, there's so much of thing. The obesity, what is very interesting is it precedes the development of the well-known complications like cardiovascular risk. And the genetic predisposition, in fact, provides an environment for adverse outcomes. That means to makes the complexity more. Very simple cartoon. The genes, most important influence is on the appetite behavioral traits and the environmental influences, which could be, from sedentary habits to stress to availability of food itself, makes more food intake, and that leads to phenomenal obesity. Now, where are we with genes? I think you take even peripheral neutrophil DNA sample, do the genotyping single nucleotide polypeptide using either chemiluminescence or microarrays. Do a statistical analysis in terms of prevalence of the particular disease and the particular genes. You can bring in an association of genetics with the disease, and thus we define the possible candidate genes that is responsible for the disease. So there appears to be a significant interaction between obesity and gene environment. There is a very interesting subject called the calorie equation, and the balance of calories stoned and burned dependent on the genetic makeup. Can really genetic influence? There are roughly about 400 different genes that were shown to contribute to obesity in terms of affecting the appetite, satiety, metabolism, food craving, body fat distribution, and the tendency to cope up with stress. I think all these things are somehow directly or indirectly related to the genetic influence. There is a caveat that the genes account for just 25% of predisposition to be overweight, while in majority of the diseases it is as high as 70 to 80%. So we may not attribute primary pathogenesis as genetics, but genetics does contribute to the obesity. So this cartoon actually adds up several factors, ultimately boils down to the lifestyle, which actually co-work with the genetic changes, and then that makes the gene expression that leads to obesity. There are three main and it has been also found to be fruitful for obesity related traits, and the Jivas itself contributed something close to 176 publications using 52 loci over the last 4 years. And the potential obesity and childhood obesity are good predictors of adult obesity. That means those people who are obese at their young remain obese even at late stage. I think the most important that we all should remember, because genetics is a tough subject, and this particular gene called the FTO gene, fat mass and obesity associated gene, seems to be the fundamental genetic determinant from the Jiva studies, and intronic variant, which is a variant here, it is an mRNA variant, which has in multiple independent studies has shown that the variants of FTO, that is the fat mass and obesity associated gene, plays an important role both in obesity and also in type 2 diabetes, which we see together as a large association. That means the FTO has an implication both in obesity and type 2 diabetes. The same thing, the association of FTO obesity has been replicated even in longitudinal studies in children, and it is also related to the cardiovascular disease. Now, I think without much complication, I would draw your attention to a couple of genes which seems to be more common in this Venn diagram. The FTO, which I just said, the fat mass associated gene, and the MC4R. These are the genes which decide the BMI, body fat, and the waist circumference ratio, and the early onset of diabetes. There is an overlap of so many genes. Probably as a gastroenterologist or as a hepatologist or even as a bariatric physician, we may not right now try to identify which gene in this particular individual could be responsible for obesity is beyond practice. Now, if chronic obesity is applicable to both syndromic and non-syndromic, but the non-syndromic tend to be more polygenic and the syndromic tends to be monogenic. That means single gene decides the disease pattern. And in any syndrome, if there are other associations, those genes also add to it. But in a non-syndromic, it is the polygenic which decides several entities, like the combo of obesity, type 2 diabetes, or a polycystic ovary syndrome, or a sleep apnea syndrome, and the stress related and an increased appetite or eating habits. All these have variable effects on the fat mass of the total body. So you look at syndromic forms and non-syndromic forms in the genetic inheritance of obesity, and there are several genes But the one which I was telling about MC4 or FTO should be remembered when suppose there is a question which is asked, can you tell me a couple of genes which are responsible for obesity? Quickly you should be able to say FTO and MC4R as the most important as we go down and see. These are, tables copied from the textbooks, which so many syndromes have a monogenic association with various diseases that leads to obesity. That means the genes which I have shown in the Venn diagram somehow appear in all these diseases. Okay, look at the monogenic obesity presents as a rare condition, and the severe obesity being attributable to a recessive mutation coding the key metabolites in the pathway of hypothalamic control appetite. Whatever I read, something very interesting is it is not that the fat cell is changed because of the gene, it is the hypothalamus increased appetite and the craving for food is probably most important determinant. Similarly, identification of the leptin melanocortin pathway is also involved in one of the monogenic obesity or satiation as one of the stop theories in obesity. That means you could see somebody who is obese, they remain resistant and they don't even respond. The FTO gene, probably we talk more about it, but suffice to say that the mouse model studies validated the role of FTO in controlled food intake, energy homeostasis, energy expenditure, and there are the nearby genes. Most of these genes are located in 14, 16 gene numbers, and you have another modification of the FTO in the form of two other genes close to the FTO gene. So this is the center of gene with so many variations that decide the birth weight, waist-hip ratio, visceral obesity, extreme obesity, and BMI related body fat. And there is an overlap, and you can see this star in the center that these two are the genes which probably add on to the other genes, make them obese. Genetic information of both monogenic and polygenic obesity has shown predominantly in the appetite and brain associated gene variants. And the most important is there are likely an effective therapeutic interactions which can come in nutritional and pharmacological intervention. That's where probably some of us would be interested. Even if it is a gene dependent disease, can we have some intervention to stop? Because most of the time, the gene which decided is lifelong and has an impact on lifelong. But if you can control the gene by your own interventions, which could be, let us say, a lifestyle modification, two pharmaco interventions, I think you win over the situation. Polygenic obesity is also dependent on genetic interactions with environmental, lifestyle, and cultural factors. I think these are all again some more genes which are added which decide. For example, somebody who is smoking and somebody who has got craving for alcohol. I was reading quite an interesting article on alcoholic liver disease that there is a gene in the brain which actually even makes them crave for alcohol. That is why even if you treat alcoholic liver disease, in 3 months he goes back to alcoholism because it is not the problem of the liver, it seems to be the problem of brain. I think we need to look at those things when you do a holistic treatment. And these studies have also identified polymorphism within genes earlier known to be involved in monogenic obesity. That's what the simplicity would be, that what we thought obesity could be monogenic would be now a polygenic inherited disorder, and the Jiva studies have shown more genes. And in a large meta-analysis study, we talk about these exomes and targeted sequences in the genetic pattern. Rare functional coding variants were seen in few genes. That means if you take 100 obese, you may have different genetic variants within these people, but there is a commonality somewhere at the FTO or MC4R, and all ultimately decide that he is obese because of these genetic mapping. Another study also investigated the role of PNPLA3. All of you are familiar that this is the gene that decides the NASH, and it is upregulated by sucrose feeding in a mouse model and found to create a NAFLD-like picture. And again, this gene could also be found in obese people, and together they form NASH. probably this PNLP3 decides more liver fat accumulation than elsewhere. Leptin adiponectin is another key regulator, and there are genes which control leptin and adiponectin, and they also lead to the pathway of obesity. MC4R is encoding the melanocortin 4 receptor, and this variant, particularly one of these genes, has a higher intake of total energy, higher dietary, absorption and retention of the fat. I think these genes decide craving for food, eating more metabolism of the fats and storing of the fats would decide the thing. Several genetic variants have been shown to interact with, which I was just telling, that adds to smoking and lesser exercise or lifestyle, low lifestyle issues also make them obese, which are again genetically determined. The very interesting study which I could get in one of the Tehran studies, and there it metabolically healthy obese, and there are unhealthy obese is an interesting longitudinal study, and we could see some of those very obese people happily walking, and there are many doctors who are actively practicing, but they are metabolically compromised. But we see some people who are metabolically sick and they're unhealthy and obese. I think this group leads to this group is a longitudinal study, not yet very clear. And these so many genes have been identified in these people. And the conclusion of this study, which is a very good study, which is recently published, that the genes were more significant in women. Maybe that's what we see, that the women are more obese in some countries, and that could be again genetic. I was also attracted by a couple of cartoons. Ultimately, we talk whenever we and there is a rapid weight gain, overweight, and obesity. And this leads to insulin resistance, which is again a genetic dependent phenomenon. It is not that all gene variants have this. Some of people are so insulin sensitive. But ultimately, it leads to all the said metabolic events and leads to arteriovascular changes. And these are the vascular changes which increases the cardiovascular. Why are we interested? If you can control the genetic variations by some method, maybe the intervention could be nutrition, intervention could be exercise, or drugs which control any of these metabolic events, we may be able to prevent the progression of the vascular disease. So can genetic findings lead to treatment for obesity? Let me summarize this complex slide into a sentence where if you know that this is the gene that is controlling this particular phenotype, intervening with the drugs can control the gene to some extent. That means we know that this gene can, with causing this phenotype, could respond to this drug. So genetic determinant of drugs would be very important, and this is what a very good example, the MC4 agonist cetimelanetoid leads to significant weight loss. So that is where we probably look at future, that genetic mapping of an obese patient, identifying certain pharmacological interventions will help in responding, so that we know that that particular group responds to that particular drug because of this particular genetic mapping. Another interesting is, all these days we were talking about lean NASH. The lean NASH is a phenomenon. We didn't explain why this one. He has almost all NAFLD syndrome and then goes into complications. But now a lot of studies, can't go into the details of these studies, they have found that this is again genetic. That means lean NASH, unlike the obese NASH, is also genetically related. In a very good study which was published last year, the conclusion of this study is the value of increase brought upon by using clinically ascertained extremes to study these complex traits provide a valuable resource on which to study the resistance to obesity and an increasingly obesogenic environment. Why somebody remain thin? Why somebody become obese? And we see that lean Nash never become an obese Nash, and an obese Nash never becomes lean. Obviously, these two are two genetics which decides which pathway they should decide. There is a word used called thrifty genes, which actually not really identified, but there is a mixed genome in that. They help us to conserve energy and store fat. This is the third component in a phenotype where there are people who eat continuously, but they don't gain weight. So there is some, again, a third genetic makeup which never makes them obese, and they're able to control the metabolism very nicely. So let me make my interesting observation in this particular area is what we spoke a little bit about the genetic inheritance of obesity in the form of FT4 gene and MC4R as the important genes. We also looked at NASH, lean NASH syndrome, and the pathway, which makes them hyperphasic and eat more food, increased metabolism to keep more fat in the body, but we are also moving towards epigenomic, transcriptomics, and the individual proteins and the genes that decide and metabolites that decide. So the bioinformatics is a big science by itself. I think it's beyond the comprehension of many of us. I suddenly found that even his behavior is genetic and his disease pattern is obetic. The family subscribes to a racehorse theory of human development. He says the family success is genetic. I think that's okay. So let me end by saying happy Navaratri to all of you. And to summarize, the genetic impact on obesity is very significant. Number of genes decide obesity. Particularly mention should be made for the FTO and MC4R genes, which are the critical genes which decide many metabolic events, along with so many other polygenic inheritance. Lean NASH is also genetic. That is interesting. And the entire disease, probably we are looking at controlling obesity using genetic mapping to find out which drug responds or which intervention responds. Because sometimes even a bariatric surgery did not help some of the people. If you
continuation में है ना हाँ, ठीक okay.
So if you know that these are the people who do not respond by their genetic mapping, we may not advise any procedure. Thank you very much. This is all the best I could do in this complex subject.
Well, thank you, Setu. I think you've done quite a lot for telling us all about the genetics and giving us an insight into this complex process. As per the plan of the meeting, we are going to have a panel discussion at the end of the meeting. So we'll come back to you with questions for your topic at that time. So I'll now
I think I'll ask, and I'll just hear. Right. I think I should stop hearing. Yeah, so that it helps.
Yes, thank you. And for the next presentation in this for this evening, it's a great pleasure for me to welcome Dr. Shiva Prasad. Hi, Shiva.
Hello.
I think after Setu, Shiva, and I can see Dr. Nageshwar Reddy is a very heavy Telangana and Andhra Pradesh flavor this evening. So Shiva Prasad is one of my best friends in gastroenterology. We have been together at the All India Institute of Medical Sciences and have known each other since 1980, 80 in the mid 80s. And Shiva is one of the very cerebral gastroenterologists who reads and covers everything and always. I couldn't think of a better speaker who to talk to us about the next topic, which is, does timekeeping govern obesity? What is the role of circadian rhythm alterations in obesity? Shiva?
Yeah. Can I have my slides up? Are my slides seen? I'm not able to see them myself.
No, not really, Shiva. I think you need to
sharing a screen, but
I stopped sharing.
No, I'm getting only speakers here.
Uh,
Dr. Shiva, you need to specifically share the mic PowerPoint, not the screen.
Okay. Yeah, okay. It's coming.
Yeah.
Yeah.
yes.
Can you make it
Yes,
full
sir.
screen? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Just 1 minute. Uh, yeah. Can I start now?
Yes, Shiva, please go ahead.
Yeah, okay. So first, I'd like to thank Anil for this opportunity, and thank you, Vivek, for those generous remarks. And what I would be discussing in the next 15 minutes is the role of the circadian rhythm in the pathogenesis of obesity and metabolic syndrome. So for many decades, looking just looking at caloric balance as what as responsible for obesity and the metabolic syndrome, and this is, I'd say, quite simplistic and probably ineffective also. In the last decade, we've been looking at the composition of the diet. Even if isocaloric diets are taken, the composition of the diet was found to be important, and we've focused a lot of attention on changing the composition of the diet. But now it has been it's apparent, or even it has been for some time, that circadian rhythm, that is including the timing of the meals and consequent chrono disruption, has profound effects on numerous physiological, metabolic processes, etc., and is critical for health and well-being. So this is how the circadian system is organized. We have inputs that are what are called light givers, and that is time givers. In German, the term Zeitgeber is a time giver. So you have the light dark cycle, you have social activity, you have physical exercise, you have food as the external time givers, and the main conductor of this whole orchestra is the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the hypothalamus, which is like works like the central pacemaker for the whole body. And from there you have peripheral pacemakers in each organ. So each organ, almost all tissues of the body, especially the important organs, have their own pacemakers. And then they also have the outputs consequence to the brain and the SCN and in forms of sleep wake cycle, locomotor activity, etc. So this whole circadian clock is actually regulated. The core mediators are the clock and BMAL1. These are the two main transcription factors that collectively drive the transcription of a large array of clock control genes. And they also orchestrate the transcription of their own precursors, that is purr and cry. And this is a self-regulated feedback loop. And in fact, in 1917, for this work in this field, the Nobel Prize in Physiology of Medicine was awarded. But I have to admit that in 1917, when I saw the news, it just looked like they were figured out what causes jet lag. And only when I read more into the topic, I realized how important the circadian system is important for metabolic health. So once the circadian system is disrupted in terms of what between external and internal factors, you have what is called chrono disruption. So the causes of chrono disruption can be as regards the inputs. You might have weak time givers, or you might have conflicting Zeitgebers, or a shift in Zeitgebers, uncoupling of the oscillators, and then you have what is called chrono disruption, and this is with a large number of consequences: obesity, metabolic syndrome, etc. The whole works what we normally associate with the metabolic syndrome are also related to the disruption of the circadian system. Highlighting the same point again, so as I said, you have external time givers and you have the suprachiasmatic nucleus.
I think there's some problem with the audio.
Yeah, we can't hear you at the moment, Shiva.
Dr. Saraswat, we can have a few questions meanwhile while Dr. Shiva is reconnecting. You are muted, Dr. Saraswat.
Right. Okay. I think Dr. Setu, are you there? Yes.
Yeah, I'm there.
So while we get getting Shiva back, uh, mm, you talked about the role of obesity and nature and nurture are, what is the relative component contribution of genetic factors overall to the problem of obesity, do you think?
If I understand correctly, whatever I understand is the genetics play a reasonable part in the pathogenesis of obesity, while the environment contributes to a significant extent. And I think the word stress is also used for people becoming hyperphasic in eating habits. And if the genetics adds to store them in the body, then they become obese. I think it's a mutually supportive in producing. Maybe obesity is not entirely genetic like what you see in some other diseases, but it does play a significant role.
You're right. So these are the genetic abnormalities are mainly in the form of handling of the food, their storage, and thus excessive adiposity, or is it
Yes.
also genetic involved in the behavioral patterns of eating and continuously eating in excess of demand? So satiety centers, etc., being affected. What exactly is the understanding?
Yeah, you are actually right. You hit at the nail correctly. Some of all these genetic mechanisms go through the hypothalamic system. And the hyperphagia which comes or increased eating added by stress. For example, availability of food makes them obese. If you see those people who are not accessible to food may not become obese is one of the factors. Siva, are you ready? Okay. So I think what you said is right, that it is a poly, polygenic multifactorial is the right word to use.
Thank you, Setu.
Shiva is back. Shiva, are you back?
Yeah, he's probably trying to.
Yeah. Dr. Vivek, can we switch on to Professor Ramesh till then we can come back to Shiva?
Okay.
I think so.
So I think maybe somebody can call Shiva and let him know so that
Yeah.
we'll move on.
Yeah, Dr. Ramesh, are you ready with your slides, sir?
Yes.
Yeah, I think we can let Dr. Shiva come after that once he's ready.
Okay. Thank you. So I think it'll be a great pleasure for me to introduce Professor Ramesh Kharduri as we move on in this because of some technical glitches. We move to the next talk in the series. And Professor Ramesh Kharduri is a professor of medicine, endocrinology, and metabolism at the Eastern Virginia Medical School in Norfolk, Virginia. Professor Kharduri is no stranger to India. In fact, it's a great pleasure for me personally to welcome him because during his couple of years when I just joined SGPGI in Lucknow, overlapped, and I remember him as a very familiar face on SGPGI campus, setting up the Department of Endocrinology here. After his graduation from Government Medical College, Srinagar, Professor Kharduri did his MD from the All India Institute of Medical Sciences before moving to the US for his fellowship in internal medicine and then in endocrinology and metabolism. And after spending 3 years at the Joslin Clinic in Boston, he's moved to many academic centers and is presently at the Eastern Virginia Medical School. Apart from extensive list of publications, over 140 publications, he's also been a reviewer and an examiner at multiple places and a researcher with a long list of grants, and I'll not be able to do them justice in the limited time we have. So with these words, I welcome Professor Kharduri and I request him to speak to us about is calorie a calorie, the role of disequilibrium of energy metabolism. Professor Kharduri, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, sir.
Okay. Good evening. Thanks for inviting, and it's my pleasure indeed to be participant in this particular webinar. I was excited to see Dr. M.P. Sharma, who was my teacher back when I was at AIMS, and Vivek, I remember distinctly when he was interviewed for position at SGPGI. And initially, we were just 5 people designated to design each center, and I was charged with the design of Endocrine Sciences Center, which has since mushroomed. I just wanted to tell you one fact. I'm sure all of you know that we would not be talking about obesity and understanding of it unless we remember the name B.K. Anand. Balakrishna Anand was a professor of physiology at AIMS back when I was there, and prior to that, as Lady Harvey. He was instrumental in designating the Satiety and Feeding Center when he was back at Yale in 1951. As a matter of fact, there's a paper by Brobeck and Anand which kind of delineates these centers in hypothalamus and how these several inputs are impinging on these centers to either put us in a state of satiety or hunger. And that's the seminal contribution that Dr. Anand has made, and we should remember that because, after all, Dr. Anand is our own Indian individual. Obesity has been of interest for the last 150 years, perhaps. But if you look at this cartoon, modern humans came on this earth about 40,000 years ago, although the first human ancestor perhaps appeared about 4 million years ago. But the humans that we are now is only a 40,000 year history in the span of billions of years. Why obesity has become so much center of attraction, it is not just because of the appearance. Because if you look at the old ancient Greek, Roman literature, obesity was actually celebrated. Most of the paintings are people who are obese, and they're enjoying themselves in various scenarios. Obesity became of interest since the morbidities came along, and which have kind of given it impetus to obesity research. Now, currently, as we deal with obesity, to me, I just put this definition of obesity, not just being an overweight or increased BMI. I think it's an unhealthy state in most instances of an overweight accompanied by metabolic derangements of impaired glucose tolerance or diabetes, abnormal fat distribution, NASH and FLD, which is of interest to most of you as gastroenterologists and hepatologists, hypertension and sleep apnea, to name a few. There is a certain percentage of people who are metabolically healthy but obese, and that's the paradox of obesity. But one thing that's very common to that particular group is that they're very physically active. Their physical endurance is excellent, and they train themselves. So it may be something that they're able to mitigate the deleterious effect of obesity by expending calories in the form of being physically very active. Pathogenesis of obesity is somewhat complicated, but I will draw your attention to a very good publication if you're interested in, and that was in Endocrine Reviews in 2017. It's called The Pathogenesis of Obesity, and Schwartz is one of the authors, but interestingly, in this mix of many authors is Rudy Leibel. Rudy Leibel is a professor of medicine currently at Columbia, but he spent most of his life at Rockefeller, and he's actually contributed significantly to physiology of leptin. As a matter of fact, there is this tussle. Was it Friedman or was it Leibel who discovered leptin in the first place? It seems lately this dispute has been settled and Leibel has gracefully stepped aside, and so the credit is given for large part to Friedman. So, to come back to obesity, obesity involves two related but distinct processes. One is the sustained positive energy balance, that is, the energy intake exceeds energy expenditure. Second, once we have reached this disequilibrium, the resetting of the body weight set point at an increased value is an anomaly to us because we don't understand how this comes about and how does the body now defend this biologically unhealthy weight. Those cues, those influences remain to be fully understood. And once we have some insight into that, we may be able to tackle obesity in a totally different way. Impact of diet on obesity risk is explained largely by its effect on calorie intake rather than changes in the expenditure. As a matter of fact, Rudy Leibel has a statement. He says you can get away with the chemistry of a calorie, but you cannot get away with its physics. Calorie is a calorie. Thus, habitual consumption of highly palatable foods predispose to excess weight gain. Unfortunately, these highly palatable foods tend to be fat dense. Now, fat is unique. Why we prefer it? It gives us the taste. B, it's easy to carry. It doesn't have much water attracted to it. And therefore, this energy store is easy to transport by individuals from one place to another place. I'll give an example of a yellow-breasted robin. Yellow-breasted robin makes annual trip from the mainland USA to Caribbeans and covers a distance about 3,000 miles. Maybe a single flight would not be possible, but several stops in between. But nonetheless, it just is able to complete the journey simply by the fat that is stored under its wings. Now, if we were to give this yellow-breasted robin same amount of energy in the form of, say, glycogen, which has water, it also provides energy. The yellow-breasted robin will not be able to lift itself off the ground, so it will be stuck there because of the weight. So fat gives us this advantage because it is dehydrated, it's calorie dense, it's easy to transport. So no wonder we store fat that easily. Beyond the environmental factors that confer the obesity risk, there are, of course, inputs from genetic and epigenetic and developmental factors. We heard about genetics and also briefly a peek into epigenetics, and those factors, by and large, are important, but they don't explain bulk of obesity, however. Although the model that is proposed by Rudy Leibel and most of his colleagues who have spent lifetime in obesity and nutrition research, there is an alternate model that has been proposed, and this came from David Ludwig from Harvard Children's Hospital in Boston. And they said much of the obesity cannot be explained by this calorie in, calorie out model. It's the result of carbohydrate and insulin interaction driven primarily by insulin resistance. First of all, I want to disabuse you of the notion that insulin resistance has been drilled into our minds for the last 3 to 4 decades. It is not as solid and it cannot explain everything. Insulin resistance has been a major distraction in diabetes and obesity research. It's my personal view, and I have been on record for the last 30 years to state this position that it is a major distraction. And now we are finding that seems to be true. Because with the experience of insulin sensitizers, we didn't see all the benefits that would have accrued if insulin resistance was the main driver of either diabetes or obesity. There's a nice paper that was published by Ludwig in JAMA in 2018. It says Beyond Calories In and Calorie Out. But in the same issue, there's an editorial that has been written by Hall and Rudy Leibel. It says the carbohydrate intake model of obesity is difficult to reconcile with current evidence. There is some merit to this model. Time doesn't permit me to go into that. But if at the end of the session we'll be able to talk about it, I would be happy to get into it a little bit. However, the thing is that even now, it seems that the alternate model of insulin and carbohydrate doesn't fully explain, and calorie in, calorie out still seems to be quite powerful. Now, regardless of how we ingest calories, whether it's the appetite which is governed by several factors, both at hypothalamus, or whether it is something driven by taste, habit, or environment, ultimately the energy has to be expended. The bottom line is that regardless of how you consume it, where it comes from, you have to ultimately dispose it. And we know that much of the disposal of the energy comes in the form of this electron chain transport system located in the inner membrane of the mitochondria, and the four complexes that are responsible for it mostly pushing hydrogen into matrix, and then ultimately this hydrogen is used, pumped back through a system called chemiosmosis that is driven back into matrix to synthesize ATP. And in this way, about 32 to 34 moles of ATP are synthesized, which is energy rich, and this is used to drive storage of energy mostly. So if there was a way that we could bypass this entire system, how we ingest calories, where do they go, and if we could able to come to the final pathway, which is the ATP synthesis, if we'd be able to somehow disrupt this process, we would be able to dissipate energy in the form of heat. And that is what will be then responsible for weight loss. Back in 1950s, a syndrome was described as Luft syndrome. I'm sure most of you have read about it, which was a state where people were almost behaving like hyperthyroid state. No matter how much they ate, they would not be able to gain weight. They were thin and lean and yet consuming tons of calories. We didn't have a good insight into what it was, how it was caused, till it became clear that past this complex 4 of the electron chain transport, we have this where ATP synthase is located, and upstream from here is uncoupling protein, or the UCP. So most of the times what happens, we have chemiosmosis, the hydrogen that has been pumped into inner and outer membrane of the mitochondria is pumped back through the ATP synthase system, and it's then converted into ATP. It is used to generate ATP, I beg your pardon. Now, alternatively, there are some situations that have actually largely due to research that was done at Washington University in St. Louis, where they found that in that situation, people who were behaving like Luft syndrome, there was a destruction here. The UCP protein, uncoupling proteins, were expressed more extensively. The net result was there was less chemiosmosis, less transport of ATP through the ATP synthase. ATP synthase was actually rendered functionless, and you had more uncoupling protein, and you had thermogenesis and therefore weight loss. So is it possible that we could regulate ATP synthase and therefore then shunt the energy towards more expenditure, which would be another limb of this calorie in, calorie out? That we would stimulate the process of calorie out to overcome any disruption, any abnormality of the calorie in arm of this equation. And so boiling down to this, that ultimately, if we were able to intervene here, it will be the final proof that yes, the defect in obesity is primarily in this process of calorie in, calorie out, which is the disequilibrium state of ingesting calories and expending calories. This brings me back to this statement that the obesity is a state of energy metabolism, and that it is primarily a metabolic disease, and it has several points of entry and exit, but the dominant point of entry would be that the calorie does not match the calorie out. Those calories, if there's a deficit, we ingest more calories than we expend, obesity will be guaranteed. Think about it, how critical intake and its dissipation is. If you take 2 chips, potato chips, daily, extra or whatever diet you are taking, you are guaranteed a 2-pound weight gain in 1 year. Just 2 extra potato chips a day, and it's about 10 or 12 calories each. Now, if we believe, which I do, that it's a mismatch between intake and output, obesity could be tackled either by curtailing the energy intake, which would be by suppressing appetite, blocking energy uptake, modifying the gut microbiome, or dissipating the energy by increasing the proton leak at the ATP synthase that I just described in the last slide. To the former, regarding suppressing the intake, we have some evidence, and from our own research laboratories, where we altered the gut microbiome in rat and mice, and by virtue of that, we're able to alter the efficacy of the calories that were ingested. This was published in Pharmacology Research last year. Obviously, it's easier to do in humans, but we are in the process of getting some more funding to see if it works as well in humans. But nonetheless, there is the proof of concept that if you can modify the intake arm of this equation, you may be able to restrict weight gain. Most interesting thing is how about the dissipating energy part of it, the other part, the calorie arm. This is the most difficult part to tackle, but I have two slides here which will perhaps summarize this. This is a study that was done in rats, and these rats were made fat by giving them the high-fat diet, which we all know leads to obesity. And then a compound, an ionophore, which is the was designed at Yale. It's a controlled release mitochondrial protonophore, which is mitochondrial ATP synthase is kind of blocked, and the net result is that you have energy dissipation. These rats underwent several things. They looked at the oxidation of fat and the glucose. They looked at the insulin levels, both resting and as well as during oral or intraperitoneal glucose tolerance. They also looked at the insulin clamp to see if the sensitivity had been impacted, and they also looked at the quantitation of glucose at various in plasma, in liver, and in muscle quadriceps. The red bar reflects mice that have been given this ionophore, which causes the leak. It blocks the ATP synthase, and the net result is now energy is dissipated. Look what happens. And these are our fat rats that they have been induced high-fat obesity by high-fat diet. When this proton ionophore was given, the red bars, they reflect the state after protein ionophore. You can see the glucose, which is this strip bar, and the fat, which is a solid bar. In mice, in rats that were given the ionophore, the oxidation increased. Second, if you look at the glucose levels, in the rats that were treated with the ionophore, glucose levels at baseline were low, and non-esterified fatty acid levels were also low in these mice. If you look at insulin levels, which is a hallmark of obesity, the so-called insulin resistant state, again, ionophore reduced insulin levels. If you look at during the intraperitoneal glucose tolerance test, the red lines are post-ionophore, dark lines are non-ionophore or the vehicle, and you will see in both instances, glucose levels were lower and as were insulin levels markedly lower during the intraperitoneal glucose tolerance test. Now looking at the clamp, which primarily to see the sensitivity is determined by somebody who has been given an insulin clamp to see how much glucose do you need to maintain a glucose at a particular level, the clamp level. And you will see that in this particular slide, the ionophore resulted in large amount of glucose needed to be infused to maintain a certain glucose level. In other words, insulin sensitivity was enhanced, and so you needed more glucose for this person to be able to maintain glucose at a certain level. This is the rat, by the way. And this is the glucose production by the liver. Again, once the ionophore was given, it went down to fat, and this is the glucose. And if you look at the liver triglycerides, high triglycerides that are seen in obese patients, again, the ionophore reduced this significantly. If you look at the fat stored in the muscle and the triglycerides in the plasma and also the hepatic content, both went down, which means that all the abnormalities, morbidities that are associated with obesity are completely ameliorated if we were able to work on the expenditure side of this equation by enhancing the expenditure, driving it more towards thermogenesis rather than ATP synthesis, which causes the abnormalities that are associated with obesity. Now we have the second is these rats. This is Zucker fatty rat that has diabetes, and the previous slide was where we had induced obesity just by giving high-fat diet, and this is the Zucker fatty rat. And again, you will see the glucose levels significantly reduced after giving ionophore. This is ionophore. This is plasma triglycerides significantly reduced. And if you look at insulin levels, significantly reduced. Again, during glucose tolerance check, both glucose and insulin levels reduced. If you look at liver enzymes, AST and ALT, this is the ALT, significantly reduced, significantly reduced. If you look at the liver histology, this is vehicle with fat in between, so-called NASH or fatty liver. You can see that, and post-CRMP, which is the ionophore, completely normalized. So this is a convincing evidence, and this actually was generated at Yale by Rachel Perry, which showed, and it's published in Science in 2015, that if we were to work on the expenditure side of this equation by using the ionophore, which causes proton leak. And by the way, this is based on the notion that you could use some compounds that have been previously shown to cause the uncoupling, and maybe they are helpful. Now, this compound is very familiar to us. It's dinitrophenol. Now, dinitrophenol has been used from various points on from 1930 onwards, whether it could be used to treat obesity. Unfortunately, dinitrophenol is quite toxic, so it was abandoned. It also causes hyperthermia, central that is. So it got abandoned for a long time till in 2015, actually 2013. Researchers at Yale decided that if we use lower concentration of dinitrophenol in animals, can we accomplish the uncoupling and show that there are benefits to reducing the ATP synthesis and driving it more towards thermogenesis. And so they designed this compound. It's the ionophore, and it can be given orally, like dinitrophenol, and at much lower doses, almost 10 to 100-fold lower doses than dinitrophenol, and it's less. It's not hepatotoxic, and it doesn't cause any increase in the temperature, in the central core temperature, and was quite effective to be used in rats. So I hope I have provided you this convincing evidence that you can work on the expenditure side, which justifies that there is indeed a calorie deficit. I mean, the disequilibrium between intake and the output or the expenditure that accounts for much of the metabolic disruptions that you see in obesity. See, obesity, as I reiterate, it's not just weight gain alone. And obesity is of interest because of the cardiovascular risk that's associated with it, an issue of NASH and NAFLD. If we are able to treat those and not worry about so many physical effects, we may have found answer to our quest. So what I'm saying is obesity is a consequence of energy intake versus expenditure. Metabolic restorative state can be achieved by targeting accelerating dissipation of energy, how genetic background and epigenetic effects with modulating energy intake expenditure remains to be fully explored. Current approaches do provide support for the state of disequilibrium that can be corrected in animals definitely at present and hopefully in future in humans too. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kharduri. Request you to stop sharing your screen. And I think you provided some very novel and wonderful insights, something that gastroenterologists and hepatologists are far away from, the concept of stimulating dissipation of energy as a way of restoring equilibrium between intake and output of calories. And I'm sure we'll have a lot of discussion at the back end once we finish all presentations. Well, I think
Shiva is ready, Vivek. Yeah, Shiva is ready.
Yes. So, like Arnold Schwarzenegger, Shiva Prasad is back. So this time I hope things go smoothly, Shiva. So I think if Dr. Kharduri can stop sharing his screen, and then you can.
I'm trying to get there.
Right, sir. Okay. Yes,
yeah.
That's great.
Yeah, thank you.
Maybe Shiva, you can.
That's right. Okay, fine. Can you tell me where you lost my audio?
Yes, please go on.
I was discussing this slide.
Yes, this one. Here at the central and the peripheral level.
Yeah, this was the last slide that I was showing. And yes, so when the systems are aligned and misaligned, then you can see downstream that the clocks are out of sync and the functions of the various peripheral organs are not in line with the circadian, the rhythm that we follow. So a disruption in circadian rhythm can be a consequence of sleep deprivation, sleep restriction, sleep disorders. Important one is nighttime light exposure, which is light at night, abbreviated as light at night, limited daytime exposure, shift work, jet lag, social jet lag, and change in feeding pattern, which I'll just be discussing. And the consequences of corona disruption, though, are many. For today's presentation, I'll be focusing on obesity and the metabolic syndrome. As far as the importance of shift work is concerned, as in relation to obesity, it is being shown that shift work is an important independent risk factor in the development of obesity, and this was also effect proportional to the total lifetime duration. So, like a dose-response relationship, the longer you've been in shift work, it has been shown that statistically the greater is the risk of obesity. And when even short-term acute, patients or volunteers were put into a shift, mimicked a shift work pattern of sleeping and feeding for 8 days, suddenly you could see an elevated blood glucose at the end of the 8-day period. So it was as acutely as that you can induce intolerance to glucose. Sleep, as is well known, correlates very directly with metabolic syndrome, metabolic activity. A decrease, and it's important to understand that a decrease in metabolic rate of healthy subjects is there who is subjected to sleep restriction. So if you restrict sleep forcibly, what happens to the metabolic rate is actually it comes down, which actually again is something that might promote weight gain. And again, the same effects. If you're subjecting healthy subjects to limited sleep for 4-6 consecutive nights, it showed that you had an impaired glucose tolerance and reduced glucose insulin responsiveness. You could actually induce glucose intolerance acutely with just sleep deprivation. So the way sleep interacts with the rest of the body's the energy balance and obesity and the metabolic syndrome is multiple. You have disturbances in the leptin ghrelin system. You have an increase in the time and opportunity to eat. You have altered thermoregulation and change in the metabolic rate, as I told you. You have increase in fatigue, which may lead to reduced energy expenditure. You have changes in the cortisol and other hormonal and the sympathetic activity, which and all these increase appetite, increase food intake, reduce energy expenditure, and insulin resistance and glucose tolerance end up with metabolic syndrome and obesity. The point about social jet lag is as is common in the generation today who are working irrespective of time zones. So the difference between the social clock and the biological clock is often due to work and social constraints. And so this correlates with an increased risk of all the factors that we have discussed, endocrine, behavioral, and cardiovascular risk factors, enhancing the risk of metabolic syndrome. And it has been estimated that even up to 70% of the population, the difference between the social clock and biological clock is greater than an hour, and in about 1/3 is greater than 2 hours. So again, proportionately, as the increase of this discrepancy comes about, you have an increase in metabolic disturbances. Even if you take an obese group and you see the social jet lag rates in those who are that was shown that higher social jet lag levels were observed who were metabolically unhealthy. So in an obese group who are metabolically and unhealthy, and higher biomarkers such as waist circumference, high HDL cholesterol, A1C, etc., they have a higher rates of social jet lag or higher degree of social jet lag. So as far as gastroenterologists, we are obviously interested with the relationship of corona disruption and NAFLD. And as we know, NAFLD might not just dietary causes are there of NAFLD, but it has been shown in animal models that knockout models of the clock and the PPR alpha can increase directly the risk of NAFLD, and directly circadian disruption also directly increases the risk of NAFLD, and also through increased adiposity. So we have multiple mechanisms by which corona disruption can increase the risk of NAFLD apart from the metabolic syndrome and obesity. The question comes then that now that you have central corona disruption and you have the peripheral metabolic effects, what is it that's in between that is mediating the changes? What is it that's how does corona disruption translate into these metabolic disturbances? And here I have to admit that our knowledge is still in its infancy. There are some postulates that's about what is likely to be the mediators, but we still don't know the final answer. One important factor is the autonomic nervous system imbalance, which leads to excessive visceral fat deposition. You have evening type subjects, and these are more likely to display central obesity than those who are morning types. Similarly, you have meals consumed in the evening are known to increase and lead to enhanced insulin secretion and will result in an increased deposition of visceral fat. So this autonomic ANS imbalance and the discrepancy between the central clock and the ANS clock can very well lead to the changes that we are talking about. Lipoprotein lipase is another important enzyme which determines where and when fat will be stored, and it has been said that if adipose tissue expressed lipoprotein lipase continuously, the time that an individual ingested a fatty meal would be irrelevant. The body would be able to take care of all the ingested fat. But the LPL levels normally show circadian oscillations, but as long as the LPL peaks at meal times, FFAs will be properly stored. But if you do not have LPA levels peaking with the meal times, then it's quite likely that the FFAs are stored in ectopic tissues, resulting in lipotoxicity, hepatic lipotoxicity, muscular lipotoxicity, as we well know is the situation with the metabolic syndrome. Another hypothesis is through the pineal hypothalamus adipocyte pathway, and this relates to the effects of hibernation and what are the metabolic changes that occur in animals in hibernation. And we know that hibernation is an insulin-resistant state during which fat weight deposits almost double through the storage of fat. And it has been hypothesized that modern westernized lifestyle, we are always getting ready for a winter that never comes. So we continue to keep storing fat because our body is always anticipating the onset of a winter. And then, of course, we have the changes in the leptin-ghrelin cycles. Normally, there are circadian rhythmicities in both leptin and ghrelin, and which they encode again for the release of the appetite-stimulating neuropeptide NPY in the hypothalamus. And when this circadian rhythm is broken, then you might have disturbances in appetite and eating and fat storage. Again, insulin secretion is an important component of mediating these metabolic disturbances, and insulin is a very clock interacting metabolic hormone. The stages of insulin release, action are both under circadian control, and genetically also occur to these transcription factors are underexpressed in type 2 diabetes patients compared to healthy subjects, which alludes that the metabolic function correlates with the clock rhythms. So when you have a normal circadian evening or a circadian misalignment, you can have all aspects of glucose tolerance affected. You can have impaired beta cell function, which is physiological in the evening but can be as a consequence of sleep restriction and circadian misalignment. You have impaired insulin sensitivity, and you had also impaired glucose tolerance. So all these will end up in the shift of the curve from normal glycemia to dysglycemia and all the consequent metabolic disturbances. Melatonin is an important mediator of this rhythm impairment, and as we know, it is produced in response to the output of the suprachiasmatic nucleus. It is called this chemical darkness because in all species studied, it is produced at night. And if you have unwarranted, even light at night, even a very low lumen category, apart from the complete darkness, it can induce an acute suppression of melatonin secretion. With age, we know sleep disturbances and other factors come in, and nocturnal plasma levels of melatonin also decline with age, giving another link. So by multiple factors, melatonin provides a potential connection between chronodisruption and the pathological states that we are discussing. Gut microbes are not far away. I think Anil will be discussing this later. But the point is that gut microbes also have a circadian rhythm, and they may influence the expression of the body's circadian clock. So you have the oscillations of the gut microbe also strengthen the interaction between. It's a bidirectional interaction, especially mediated through short-chain fatty acids, which are considered to be the reset the hepatic circadian gene expression. So through this clock of the gut, also the body's clock is influenced. A little bit about the time of feeding. As I said, we have the terms need a little clarification. When we say intermittent fasting, which is very popular nowadays, a lot of people have adopted that. Really speaking, intermittent fasting is of two varieties. One is when you have 1 or 2 days of fasting interspersed with normal ad lib eating, which in this case is not supposed to be, which is not really clock dependent. It is more caloric restriction. And you have time restricted feeding, where you have the daily eating duration between the first and last energy intake is typically reduced from 12 to 24 hours to eating window. This is a popular time restricted feeding that is commonly practiced nowadays. And of course, you have chronic energy restriction. So when you have time-restricted feeding, there are very important, significant metabolic effects. And in overweight humans, time-restricted feeding has, just by reducing the feeding window, eating window from 14 to 10 hours a day, you can induce weight loss. And then there are trials also which show that crossover trials for TRF versus a normal 12-hour feeding window, you can improve the levels of A1C and IGT. So in multiple ways, time-restricted feeding improves weight gain as well as the metabolic consequences of obesity. And through again interaction with the circadian clock, you give a long period of time at which you're not eating, then that is in sync with the rest of the body's rhythms, and then reduces insulin sensitivity, reduces insulin resistance, etc. So now we come to possible treatments for obesity using chronotherapy. So we all know about intensive lifestyle interventions, pharmacotherapy, and bariatric surgery. But it's important now to think in terms of adding on chronotherapy to these existing options, and which is bright light in the morning, melatonin before bedtime, proper timing of food intake, adequate sleep, and all these have no contraindications and no side effects. So highlighting a little more, as I said, you have by regulating the inputs from light, sleep, feeding, and exercise, or regulating the outputs of melatonin, or regulating the cortisol rhythms, or if we are able to again have a better genetic understanding of which kind of, because we know there is a lot of variation in circadian rhythms between people. So what is it that individually that person is, what is his chronobiology, and then tailor your feeding and activity related to that. I think once we have better understanding, that will also help us. The actual interventions are not too many. Melatonin is the one that has shown the most promise in providing metabolic benefits. In a meta-analysis of 7 RCTs, there is improvement in nocturnal hypertension with long-acting melatonin supplementation. In a double-blind RCT, patients with diabetes and CAD underwent just melatonin 10 grams daily supplementation and showed improvement in a number of parameters. In trials with NASH, melatonin supplementation has shown normalization of transaminases. So they're definitely encouraging trials with melatonin for all the characteristics that we're looking at. I would just like to highlight for a minute on nobiletin, which seems to be a very interesting molecule. It is found in the oily peel of orange and other citrus species, and it has this action of binding to the core clock proteins responsible for stabilizing the 24-hour cycle. And in one study, they fed 2 groups of mice 24 hours high-calorie unlimited feeding. And when they were given nobiletin, the same mice stayed slim, even as the control mice put on nearly twice their body weight in just 10 weeks. I think that is a very interesting finding, and it also improved other markers like fasting glucose and cholesterol. The mechanism of action of nobiletin, as I told you, is through these retinoid orphan receptors and modulating the clock-Bimali complex that I had mentioned earlier. So what happens is that an amplitude enhancement of the circadian cycle from a low amplitude to high amplitude state that improves energy homeostasis, and the mouse doesn't put on weight. Whether it applies to humans or not would definitely be interesting. There are a number of potential benefits that have been observed with nobiletin. Is it all related to modulating of the circadian clock? If it is so, then it would be a very interesting line of treatment or equivalent molecules which have the similar kind of action. So in conclusion, what I would like to say is how much we eat and what we eat has always been shown to be important. But now when we eat, I think is also been shown to be equally important. The circadian rhythm is one of the key regulators of metabolism and weight gain, and even though the simple measures that are already available, they are extremely difficult. I have to admit, they are extremely difficult to implement in modern societies. And as any of you all can actually implement it in your own homes with your own children, then please do let me know. So melatonin and nobiletin are, encouraging molecules. They are likely to be effective, but unfortunately, both of them do not have commercial potential because they're not patentable. So unless there is some new molecule which has similar actions but which has potentially, commercial benefit, we might be still groping for the right molecule to treat these disorders. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Shiva Prasad. Went flawlessly this time, and I must congratulate you on a very lucid and a clear presentation when I read the topic for the first time, I was wondering what is this going to be about circadian rhythms and obesity? How does that come in? But now I think all of us are quite clear how important. So maybe we should move to Jain eating times, eating before sunset or something like that.
Yes.
So we'll probably have some questions for you
Yeah.
in the discussion going to be. So moving along with the presentations, I think it's Dr. Anil Arora. Dr. Anil Arora has been a decades-long associate and a great friend of ours, of all of us here, and he's taking wonderful initiatives in promoting academics in this period when I think Corona has given us an opportunity to learn a lot while we sit at home. So, and Dr. Anil Arora, as all of you know, is the chief of gastroenterology at the Sir Gangaram Hospitals, and a well-known clinician and has done a lot of research and has a long list of publications. He will be speaking to us about the role of diet, lifestyle, and gut microbiomes. Do they all conspire together in the pathogenesis of obesity? So, without further ado, may I invite Dr. Anil Arora to present his.
Dr. Arora, you are muted.
Anil, can you unmute your microphone, please? Dr. Arora?
I have unmuted. Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Yes, now we can.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Vivek. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, obesity is defined by excess body fat, typically by a very innocuous definition of something called body mass index. So if you have a BMI of less than 18.5, you are underweight. Between 18.5 and to 24.9, you are normal weight. Anybody more than 25 of BMI is obese. Now, obesity can further be classified into class 1, class 2, or class 3, depending upon what is your BMI level. But all of us know that this measurement of obesity by BMI is very crude, incomplete, incongruous, and has limited clinical utility. And hence, to overcome that, recently in March 2020, there is a new suggested classification of obesity, which is scientifically acceptable and medically actionable. So it is called ABCD of classification. A is what Dr. Setu Babu told us about the etiology of the obesity. B is the BMI based classification. C is the associated and concomitant complication, and D is the degree of complication. So this is what we are going to define in obesity in our future presentation. As Dr. Ramesh has already told us that the obesity has its root in the evolution. In ancient time, there was shortage of the food, and hence human beings had to travel long distances, leading to hunting and gathering of the food to catch hold of food, whatever was available. So the limited quantity of the food which was available had to be stored as fat to cope up with the long periods of the time during which the food was not available. So the organisms or the species which were able to store their fat in the form of food, fat for a long period of time, were able to survive. Rest all became extinct. So this led to the natural selection of a excessive fat genotype as a model for survival. That means any species which was used to storing fat and had the ability of to store fat for survival survived. Rest all became extinct. But thanks to agriculture revolution which started 10,000 years ago, then the onset and then availability of the supermarket which started in US in 1930, and the e-marketing of Zomato and Swiggy, that has given us easy availability of the food, but unfortunately, the evolutionary changed energy conserving phenotype of fat has still persisted. So you have a easy availability of food in presence of plenty of food, in presence of a metabolically active fat preserving evolutionary attained genotype that has led to this episode and the epidemic of obesity. So who is at risk? Coming to the diet as the cause of pathogenesis. There is always a discussion amongst the pathologists which type of fat or diet is bad. Is it high carbohydrate, high fat or high calorie diet? What matters? As Dr. Ramesh said, the basic problem of obesity is the imbalance between what you take and what you expend. So whenever you have intake is more than the expenditure, then you will tend to develop obesity. So what is the relevance of diet in this cycle of energy intake and energy expenditure? Let me tell you what does energy expenditure mean. So in a patient who, there are four types of way we can expend the energy from the body. You have a resting metabolic rate, you have non-exercise induced thermogenesis, you have exercise induced thermogenesis or the heat loss, or you have a diet induced uh, thermogenesis. What does it mean? Resting expenditure means you are consuming ATP to maintain the physiological processes at rest, like maintaining the cell membrane potential across the cell membrane. Then you have this something called NEAT, that is energy consumed in the normal day-to-day activities like walking, sitting, standing, household work, etc. 5% of the energy is expended when you tend to do a planned physical exercise, and 10% of the daily energy is expended in terms of digestion, including mastication, absorption, and excretion of the food. So when somebody takes a fast food, let's say you take a fast food which consists of burger and a cup of and a glass of cold drink, you are consuming an easily available, delicious, highly palatable, calorie-dense food, which with high glycemic index will lead to raised blood levels of the glucose in the blood that will stimulate the on to the adipose tissue, and through the insulin receptors it will lead to migration of the glucose into the adipose tissue, in addition to upregulation of the pyruvate dehydrogenase and an enzyme called acetyl coenzyme A carboxylase or ACC. So once you have increased substrate in the form of acetyl CoA coupled with the activation and upregulation of ACC, you have increased fatty acid synthesis. Once these fatty acids are stored, they are converted into triglycerides, and these triglycerides then move into the various tissues. So you have high energy, high calorie dense food giving you obesity, because which is all related to the intake of the carbohydrates. Second thing which high carbohydrate diet does is, as you are taking a lot of high refined sugar, you will have increased release of the insulin from the pancreas. Typically, insulin being a lipogenic hormone, it increases the deposition of the fat in the liver. It decreases the circulating free fatty acid because it inhibits the lipolysis. And as you have less and less circulating fat in the body and in the circulation, so the major working organs like liver, heart, and the muscles, they perceive as a cellular starvation. So even though you are consuming a lot of high carbohydrate diet, you are increasing fat in the body, but the body is perceiving as a cellular starvation. So as Dr. Setu Babu and Dr. Shiva Prasad has shown us, as you are perceiving cellular starvation, the body tends to decrease the energy expenditure and asks you to have more food. So in spite of the fact that you are taking a lot of fat, you are consuming more fat, and that is how you become fat. So high carbohydrate diet typically decreases the energy expenditure, increases the appetite, and increases the adipose tissue hypertrophy. So with passage of time, a person tends to be more and more obese. This has further been confirmed by the studies recently published in JAMA by Ebling's group, in which people who had lost weight for some time were asked to take 3 different types of diet to see the impact of the diet on various components of the diet. What they clearly showed that if you take a very low carbohydrate diet, this is the best diet which leads to increased energy expenditure. We have shown you earlier that if you take high carbohydrate diet, you will have reduced energy expenditure. If you take low carbohydrate diet, you will have increased expenditure. So if you want to maintain a balance, do go on to a low carbohydrate diet. So low carbohydrate diet is associated with highest energy expenditure during the weight loss. Then there was a study in which 17 obese overweight volunteers were included, and their energy expenditure was calculated by putting them in the different metabolic chambers. Over the next 4 weeks, when these volunteers were put on very low carbohydrate ketogenic diet, there was substantial reduction in the weight as well as reduction in the fat. How did it occur? It occurred both by increasing their energy expenditure at rest and sleep. So the lesson is, if you are taking a high carbohydrate high carb with highest risk of obesity, maximum effect on decreasing energy expenditure and creating a state of positive energy balance by depositing more and more fat in the adipose tissue. But then, as Dr. Romesh has clearly told us, calorie is a calorie. Any calorie which is taken over and above the energy expenditure, irrespective of the diet, can lead to obesity. And there's a good statement from Endocrine Society scientific statement that even if you increase your daily intake or even yearly intake of as little as 3% per year. Dr. Romesh gave us an example of only 2 chips. That means even if you increase your total calorie intake by 27 calories per day per year, for next 10 years, you will end up having profound obesity. What are the dietary habits which are associated with obesity? Frequent snacking, large proportion of the meal, late evening meals may all be associated with overburden of calories, as Dr. Shiva Prasad has told, and all of these may be acting through the circadian rhythms. So unless you have a good LPL or good melatonin in the brain to take care of this, eating at frequent intervals at odd hours certainly is going to add up to more calories. Second issue which I have to discuss is the lifestyle and the obesity. Decreased physical activity, sedentary behavior, psychological factors, and sleep deprivation are known to be associated with uh, obesity. Let's come back to the energy expenditure. As I said, 55% of the energy is expended in the resting state, 30% is expended in the need state. That means non-exercise energy expenditure. Now, this need should not be confused with our own need, which is the MBBS entrance. Meanwhile, let me also congratulate Dr. S.P. Singh for producing a gem from Orissa. Dr. Shoaib Farhan scored the perfect 720 out of the 720 in the currently held 2020 NEET examination. Coming back to our own need, that is non-exercise activity thermogenesis, 30% of the calories which we spend are primarily related to the non-exercise energy expenditure. And this is extremely important because it has been shown that people who are obese, they tend to be lying more frequently, they tend to be sitting more frequently, and they tend to be less ambulatory. And it has been shown that people who are obese, they have minimum non-energy expenditure. So the lesson is, if you want to lose weight, you have to keep on increasing your non-exercise energy expenditure, which is an important determinant of the obesity. Let me tell you what does it mean. A non-exercise energy expenditure would mean simply tidying the house, gardening in your own verandas and the parks, mopping the floors, doing the dishes, shoveling the snow, and even childcare gives you so much of extensive loss of calories and expenditure of the calories, something which is totally ignored by most of us as clinicians and most of us as patients also. So indulging more in day-to-day activities rather than being sedentary can induce weight loss by increasing non-exercise energy expenditure. This is further borne by the recent analysis of last 50 years. If you see what is happening, the trends in the US, over the 50 years, you have more and more white collar jobs which are coming into being, whereas the agriculture jobs are dipping down. You have customer care, you have work from home, you have Uber which are coming into it. And with that, there is decreasing energy expenditure, both men and women. And what has that resulted is in, if you see over the last 50 years, there has been increasing weight of men and women in US, and over the last 40 years, men have increased their mean body weight by 15 kg, and women have increased their mean body weight by around 10 kg. So increased physical activity is largely ineffective. You think you can just exercise and lose your weight? The answer is no. It cannot be used as a standalone intervention in maintaining weight loss, as bodies tries to compensate for energy expenditure. Let me give you an example. If you're obese, if you think just by simply exercising your body, you have a thermostat as shown by Dr. Shiva Prasad. Thermostat will try to again drag you back by increasing the intake of the food. So if you're obese, if you're simply exercising, you will come back to the normal because the body has a tendency to come back to the normal thermostat. Which the purpose of thermostat is to maintain and defend your body fat mass. However, in persons who are susceptible to obesity, body's energy homeostasis system compensates more for weight loss than for weight gain so as to maintain the obesity. So what we have to do is in patients who are obese, if you have to want to have a long-term physical activity and maintain weight loss, you have to somehow try to dismantle this clock by constantly exercising and trying to maintain your weight loss. So with long-term constant physical activity, you are trying to reset your thermostat to a lower level. So the lower level of the fat body mass is then defendable. Other lifestyle factors which are important in causation of the obesity include psychological stress, sleep deprivation, and the obesity. They act through both the hormonal as well as the sympathetic overactivity that leads to decreased energy expenditure, increased appetite, and alteration in the insulin sensitivity. And this has been recently shown by an excellent study published in 2012 that even the cultural differences in the diet between, say, North India and South India have significant impact on the BMI and the cardiovascular morbidities. And I am sure all of us do appreciate the basic difference between a North Indian diet on the left and the right and the South Indian diet on the right. We clearly show that if you have a high calorie, easily palatable, delicious diet, you are more likely to have more increased intake of the energy. But are these dietary and lifestyle consequences, are the effect there enough to tell us that as to why do we develop obesity? In fact, we have points to ponder. There are so many people who eat heavily but still they do not gain weight, and there are people who do a lot of exercise and still they do not want to, they cannot lose weight. So it is possible that people who eat less and who are obese, is it possible that their bacteria may be extracting more energy than a person who is lean? That is where the concept of the gut microbiota came in. Is it, do we have today any bugs in the bacteria which can be debugged? That means if you get rid of the bugs, then you will become lean. Let's see what the literature says. In fact, it has been shown in the previous studies that if you take a germ-free mice and transplant them with a microbiota from the obese mice, then versus those transplantation with the mice from the lean category, those transplanted from the obese mice will gain more weight. And at the same time, if you look at the fecal energy content loss in patients who are obese, it will be less. That means most of the bacteria which are present in the obese mice will tend to extract more energy. So that means if you have bacteria which are used to extracting more and more energy in the food, they could be the causative reason for obesity in patients who are obese. So obese animals may be harboring gut microbiota that extract more calories from food as compared to the lean counterparts. In fact, it has been shown that in obesity, you have less bacteroids and more firmicutes. And as the time passes on, if you give these patients a particular type of diet which decreases, restricts the calories, you have more and more bacteroids which come in. It has been clearly shown that if you have a restriction of the calories in the diet, with passage of time, over a period of weeks and months, you will have a more bacteroids which will come into the gut flora. How does the gut flora manipulate the obesity? There are three different proposed mechanisms. They may be acting through the bile acids, through the short chain fatty acids, or through inducing the chronic inflammation. Let's see how do they act through the bile acids. Once the bile acids go into the small intestine, they are converted from the primary bile acid by the alpha dehydroxylase of the bacteria into the primary and secondary bile acids, which act on the different receptors on the intestine, which are called FXR and TGR5 receptor. FXR receptors, when they are stimulated in the gut, they produce a substance called ceramide, which is known to cause insulin resistance and predispose to adiposity. In addition, it also causes adipose hypertrophy. Ceramides are also known to cause injury to the oxidative stress to the endoplasmic reticulum and mitochondria. Moreover, the UDCA, which is present in the bile acid, is known to antagonize typically the FXRs. There is one study which has shown that if you tend to manipulate your bacteria by decreasing the lactobacillus, then you are going to increase the level of tauron beta murocholic acid, which will cause de-inhibition of the FXR receptors, leading to decreased insulin resistance. So by manipulation of the gut microbiota, you can decrease the insulin resistance. Second action by which this secondary bile acids tend to affect the obesity is through the TGR5 receptors, which act through the various mechanisms by increasing the insulin secretion and increasing the expenditure of the energy. And finally, you have short chain fatty acids, which will bypass these processes and try to increase the insulin sensitivity. Yeah. So short chain fatty acids are also known to go into the brain directly and affect the hypothalamus by decreasing the appetite and increasing the energy expenditure. So you have multitude of mechanisms by which the mycobacteria can cause obesity. In addition, it has recently been shown that mycobacteria, the microbiome also increases the gut permeability, and increased gut permeability is known to change the M1 pattern, M2 pattern of the macrophages to M1, which is inflammatory pattern, and causes inflammation in the obesity. But is there a good relationship between the microbiome and the gut? There are some unanswered questions that evidences linking specific microbiota to the obesity. They still fell short of establishing a causal relationship. There are number of studies showing contradictory results. Most studies are done on germ-free mice, which at baseline have a lean, hypermetabolic phenotype and resistant to weight gain when exposed to high-calorie diet. There are differences in the microbiota of the small and the large intestine, and studies are done by fecal implants, which compose only of the large intestinal bacteria. It is possible that the small intestinal mycobacteria may be equally important. And the recent analysis of the available literature was unable to identify reliable bacterial composition difference between the obese and the lean individuals. To sum up, microbiota in obesity is still in a preliminary stage of the research. To summarize, ladies and gentlemen, high carbohydrate diet has the highest tendency to induce obesity. Although extra calories can induce obesity, and the frequency of the diet plays an important role in reducing obesity, such that frequent snacking, large portions of the meals, and late evening meals add on to the calories over and above the energy expenditure. Lifestyle factors like sedentary occupation, lack of physical activity, stress, and sleep deprivation are the principal perturbators implicated in the pathogenesis of obesity. Indulging more and more of day-to-day activities, something called NEAT or non-exercise energy expenditure, certainly can influence energy expenditure and weight loss, which is significant in obese individuals. Body always tries to defend its fat by increasing food intake. However, if you want to sustain the maintenance of weight loss, you have to sustain the maintenance of the physical activity through the regular exercise. Association of the gut microbiota with obesity is still in the nascent stage of workup. Obese individuals have higher ratios of firmicutes to bacteroids. Their impact on the obesity is proposed through a number of actions through the bile acid, short chain fatty acids, as well as through induction of the systemic inflammation. However, there are many loopholes in the present knowledge of the gut microbiota, and we need to have a better understanding of the role of the gut microbiota in pathogens in obesity. Let me just come on to the final slide. That recently Robert B. Wilson and the Paul Milgram are the winners of the 2020 Nobel Memorial Prize in the economy. Their theory was simultaneous multiple round of actions, or SMRMAs. I think should we take this clue from them and also try to correct our SMRM, that means simultaneous multiple wrong activities we do, that is sedentary behavior, high caloric diet, sleep deprivation, and gut microbiome. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Anil. Thank you for a very elegant and a comprehensive and I might say a totally relevant presentation of a complex area. Uh, I think a lots more work needs to be done, but that work has already been started, and this probably is a session in which insights into our knowledge are being improved and will then eventually result in an actionable treatment plan. So now it's my great pleasure to move on to the next presentation in this section. And when you talk of actionable areas, probably duodenal mucosal resurfacing metabolic endoscopy is something that has captured the imagination of the whole world. And to speak on the topic of our stomach and duodenum key players, the role of gut hormones, we have none other than Dr. Nageshwar Reddy, who's the doyen of gastroenterology and GI endoscopy in this country. And I take great pleasure in inviting Professor Reddy to talk to us on this complex topic and give us his views. Dr. Reddy, sir.
Thank you, Vivek. Thank you, Anil, for giving this opportunity. If I can have my slides on. Slides are, yeah, I think. So I was asked to talk predominantly on gut hormones and their role. So what I'll do is I'll give an overview because it's not gut hormones that are responsible, but its interaction with various other factors that are important. To get these slides on. You're not given the rights for sharing. You have to give us the right for sharing. Can whoever is the administrator, can you give us the right to share the slides? Yeah. You have to give us the right.
At the bottom of the screen, you may have to click share.
No, we are doing that, but it's not. It's not coming now. No, you haven't given us the right to share. Whoever is disabled. Our thing is disabled. Somebody there has to give us the right to share.
No, sir.
Because you're not giving us the right. Actually, it was a right to share. Otherwise, we can't share. Whoever is doing the administration should give us the right to share.
So, Dr. Ashish, is Dr. Abdulaziz available on the, then maybe we can move to the next presentation while this problem is sorted out.
Hello?
Dr. Arora?
Yeah. Dr. Abdul is there?
Yeah.
Yes, I am.
Okay. So, good evening, Dr. Abdul. It's a great pleasure to welcome you. And Dr. Nageshwar Reddy sir, maybe we can move on to the next talk while this glitch is sorted out at your end. Uh, so I this opportunity to present Dr. Abdul Aziz Ghanemi from the Department of Molecular Medicine, the Faculty of Medicine at the Laval University, Quebec, Canada. Um, Dr. Abdul Aziz is currently affiliated both to the Departments of Molecular Medicine and the Faculty of Medicine and the Functional Genomics Laboratory, Endocrinology and Nephrology Access at the University of Quebec, Laval Research Center. Dr. Aziz has studied in Algeria, China, and Canada, has a rich record of international publications and scientific presentations on diverse topics, including functional genomics, obesity, and metabolism. He has been awarded numerous distinctions like awards, grants, scholarships, etc. And interestingly, he is a polyglot, speaks at least 4 different languages, which is quite an achievement. With these words, I welcome you to this evening's presentation and on your topic, the caloric factors, individual, socioeconomic, and environmental factors in obesity. Dr. Ghanemi, please. Yes, you see your screen now, Dr. Ghanemi.
I guess all is clear now.
Yeah,
Yes.
it's clear. We can hear you.
Voice and view, video, audio, video, both are okay. So we have start.
Make it full screen. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks for inviting me, and thanks for the previous speakers. I really enjoyed listening to each one of them. Actually, the topic I'm going to talk about is somehow, I would say, it summarizes some of what have already been said, in addition to some new elements, somehow diversified. And as I guess we are somehow behind the time, we try to give. So we're talking about the link, how to move from pathogenesis to socioeconomy when we talk about obesity. As all of us know, and as it has been described, obesity is real health problem. And as maybe some even professionals would think that it impacts mainly developed countries, it also has an important and negative impact even in developing countries as well. So the simple or basic definition of obesity is the loss of balance between energy intake and energy expenditure, leading to excessive fat accumulation, which represents risk factor for diverse diseases such as diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer, and other age-related and even chronic diseases. So the simple question we usually ask is why the body cannot prevent obesity? Why it is hardly reversible? This figure could help us to understand and give simple approach to explain that. On one side, we have the balancing or the regulating mechanisms that control the energy intake and the energy expenditure, mainly through signals and messages between the digestive system and the brain. However, once an unhealthy lifestyle, which is represented by an unhealthy diet, inactivity, sleep shortage, sleeping problem, maybe psychological disorder as well, all these elements come and put huge pressure on those regulating mechanisms
Therefore, the body or those biological tools are not able to keep that balance. That's why we have used the expression broken energy homeostasis, just to show or to highlight that the mechanisms are not able to be efficient, or they lose their efficiency, leading to blunted mechanisms controlling energy balance, modified perception of food. And what's also important is to mention that there would be a new body weight reference which would be increased. This means that once we gain weight, once we reach a certain body weight, the brain sets that body weight as a reference and will always work toward reaching that reference. This comes from the human biology. From a historical perspective, we are made to store fat, to store energy, so that we can go through hard times such as hunger or periods during which we are not able to find food. The other consequences such as insulin leptin resistance are also important to mention within this context, in addition to the other known pathologies. Hello?
Yes, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Okay. I think there is problem with sharing the
No, we can see your
presentation.
slide, but it's not moving forward.
Exactly, yeah. It's like frozen.
You can use the arrows in the bottom left corner of the slide.
Actually, I'm on full screen.
Yeah, so they'll come on, in the windows backward and forward arrows. Maybe escape the full screen and you'll probably be able to move.
That's what I'm trying to do, yeah. Can you stop the sharing from your side so that I can share again and start over?
Can the web stream host do something about this?
You can stop sharing now and then retry.
Yeah.
Stop sharing.
Yeah. Can you hear us, Dr. Aziz? You could probably stop sharing at your level is the suggestion.
Dr. Aziz, can you hear?
Yeah, I think we've lost his audio as well.
Hello, Dr. Aziz. It shows that he has a low bandwidth.
So maybe, but if we can start again, it might work.
Dr. Aziz, can you hear us? Yeah, yes, stop sharing. Can you share again? Dr. Aziz? Mr. Arnab, are you there?
Yes, sir, I'm there.
Can you help Dr. Aziz?
Yes, yes, I'm just checking.
Yeah, please.
Oh,
Hello,
Yeah,
Dr. Aziz.
sorry for, yeah, I apologize for this technical problem. I guess this is the
Okay.
one of the consequences of coronavirus when we do it online.
Okay.
So, can you see what I'm sharing?
Yes, I think now that we have seen this, the previous slide on which the problem happened. So this we have seen that.
This, yeah, that's where we had problems.
Yeah.
Okay, so as a conclusion of what just have been summarized, once obesity is established, the mechanisms of energy balance are broken. And as I said, the brain sets a new increased reference. So the best way actually to stop obesity is still the prevention. And the way of thinking how to treat obesity, it's more about lifestyle rather than a single therapy. And within this context, I would like to say that the most important actually is not losing weight, but the most important is to get back to a healthy lifestyle, which is more important than that, because if we want to lose weight, we can just stop eating for a period of time, but after that, we'll gain weight again. So the issue is a healthy lifestyle. Even without losing weight, it still has benefits. And the other point is that we should focus more about fat mass than about body mass. And since we are talking about the social and economic impact, I have chosen to talk about the example of the current COVID-19 crisis and how it is linked to obesity. As all of us know, many governments have taken the decision of confinement. People, they stay at home, they don't move, they eat more, maybe drink more, they develop some mental health problems, sleeping disorders. This is the first element that would lead to developing obesity.
నేను మళ్ళీ నేను దిగాను ఇక్కడి నుంచి వాళ్ళు ఇచ్చిన కనెక్షన్ ఇచ్చి ఇప్పుడు రావచ్చు.
Excuse me?
Yeah. If you could. Yeah, I mean, can all the others mute their mics, please, while the presentation is going on? Yes, please go ahead, Dr. Abdulaziz.
The second element is that the economic shutdown led to two main elements. The first one is that many people lost their jobs. The second impact on economy is that we have increased in prices. Therefore, people have less ability to afford a healthy diet. So they turn to junk food, which is unhealthy, which is high fat, high calorie, high sugar diet. The third element, it's still under investigation, but there is the possibility that COVID-19, as it impacts the lung or the respiratory system, it could reduce the ability to perform physical activity. All these three elements put together as a consequence of COVID-19 could lead to worsen the obesity pandemic, which will by kind of feedback or kind of ionic result increase the vulnerability to COVID-19. To continue, since the first speaker described some genetic aspects, I would like also to introduce the importance of genetics, but from a therapeutic viewpoint. Most clinicians use diet and physical exercise to treat obesity. Therefore, finding genes related to diet, mainly high-fat diet and exercise, would represent a starting point to deepen our knowledge about obesity-related mechanisms. Within this context, functional genomics is an important tool. When we talk about exercise-related genes, it means those genes that are overexpressed or modulated during or after physical activity. Studying those genes, as we can see on this slide, could allow us to make links between the benefits of physical activity and those genes and the pathway or the biological consequences they control. And if we can have sufficient elements to make strong links between both, we could dream of what we call exercise pill, which means a pill that we would take that would impact those exercise-induced genes and lead to having the benefits of exercise without actually doing exercise. This would be important for individuals who are not able to perform the required physical activity, such as maybe those having some heart failures or physical handicaps. The second element is diet. Identifying also diet-related genes could have the same importance as we described it for physical activity, meaning that it would allow us to better understand what does change or how the diet changes the gene expression and how we can use that to treat. Within this context, the important element why I focus on lipid-specific signal is that if we can identify one, it would be great. For instance, for glucose, we have insulin. But for lipid, we don't have actually an acute signal. Yes, we have leptin, but it's long-term effect. But short-term effect, that would be great if we could identify one. It would maybe allow us to control appetite and therefore food intake. The perspective also, since we have talked about psychology and the impact of sleeping and wake cycle, as one of the previous speakers said, maybe we could, by analogy, think of identifying even genes, as we have done for exercise and diet, genes that would be related to such concept of psychological status or even sleeping and stress, anxiety, and other mental problems. This is to summarize the genes. The idea would be to study the expression changes of genes in different tissues, mainly those involved in metabolism, such as the muscle, the liver, and the adipose tissue, and those involved in controlling the signals, such as in the brain or digestive system. The change of gene expression under the influence of specific stimuli, such as the diet and exercise. This would lead to discover novel therapeutic targets and better understand the molecular pathogenesis, develop new tools for diagnosis and prognosis as well. That was all for today, and I'd like to thank you for your time, and these are my emails for those who would like to exchange or even establish future collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ghanemi, for that overview and the assessment of the socio-economic activities and their relationships with obesity. So we will have question answers depending on the time available after we complete this session. So request you to join us and to be on with us till then. So now moving to, I think, Professor Reddy's problem with the connecting the link has been resolved. And I think without further ado, I'll welcome Dr. Reddy to please share your screen, sir, and talk to us about the very important topic of the role of stomach and duodenum as key players in obesity, particularly the role of gut hormones. Dr. Reddy?
So I'm trying to share my screen now. Hopefully it will come through. Already we're extremely late. So I think on a Sunday evening for the audience, this is not very interesting. So what I'll do is I'll try and cut short and take 10 minutes to finish this. I'll thank Anil for giving this opportunity. My talk is predominantly going to be on what stomach and duodenum have to do in this. We've had a series of very good talks on different aspects, but the main player here is the stomach and the duodenum. And we know that the stomach has the main signals which come for either restricting or increasing your energy intake. So can you see my screen is coming in?
Yeah, the screen is there on view. We are waiting for your presentation to come on.
Please share your presentation. You are sharing your screen.
No, I'm just trying to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, we have got it.
I'm sorry for this.
No problem. Yes.
Yeah.
Everybody is waiting to listen to you, sir. Please complete. Don't be in a hurry to finish in 10 minutes. We like to listen to you completely.
I'm trying. See, recent years there's been slides are not moving now. Can I just? Slides are not moving.
I think if you the yes.
Yeah, moving. Yes.
Yeah, no. So in recent years, there's been. I think next slide we have. No, we have to. So it's very paradoxical that from the. No, I think something happened in my. I'm not able to move like I want to. So I think this is not moving well, Anil. I think what we should do is that I think we should have a discussion and maybe some other time I can do this because it's not moving properly. There's something wrong with it. So we can have your discussion and maybe some other time I can do the presentation.
Well, I mean, if there is a problem persists, right.
Yeah, but it's okay. I think we should, because we're already very late, we should go to the discussion and maybe we can have this.
Maybe summarize regarding the role of gut hormones and obesity in a couple of words, and I think we can start with depending on the time available.
So I think we'll take off my slides. Slides may not be important now. Basically, the most important thing we have realized in the last few years is that the signals coming from the stomach, which are usually inhibitory. This is very paradoxical. So these inhibitory signals, which actually, no, we need not. I don't think we'll go to the slides. I'll just give a short, brief, precise conclusions of what these studies are doing. So there are two types of influences from the stomach. The baroreceptors that are coming in, which actually give inhibitory reflexes to the hindbrain. And then, of course, you have the chemical receptors, which not only give, again, inhibitory reflexes, but also they influence the arcuate ligament in the hypothalamus. So what happens now is that most of the baroreceptors are in mid part of the stomach. And we have now realized that accommodation is not important, but these baroreceptors are more important. So all the new modalities of endoscopic therapy are concentrated on decreasing the mid part of the stomach, that is the antrum of the stomach, increasing the sensitivity of these baroreceptors so inhibition can be produced. We are now very clear that accommodation, the fundal accommodation is not important, and therefore this is not addressed in all the new techniques that are coming in. The second important thing is that the only hormone which the stomach secretes, which is actually increasing hunger, this is the only hormone in the body which increases, is ghrelin. And there's evidence that ghrelin now, actually, when you do a bypass surgery or you do an endoscopic technique to actually bypass the food going directly into the duodenum, the ghrelin is not secreted, and the low amounts of ghrelin also are acting to decrease the amount of food intake that's coming in. And finally, the role of duodenum is becoming very important because I think we have had Ramesh telling us that insulin resistance may not be a factor. I think there is some evidence that although it's not the important factor, but there's a very important role in the metabolic syndrome. And there is an insulin resistance factor that we seem to be secreting from the duodenum. And excluding the duodenum, either by putting sleeves or even a bypass surgical techniques. And recently, duodenal mucosal ablation using thermal techniques or even using a laser to actually completely burn the duodenal mucosa has shown to decrease this duodenal resistance factor. Diabetes, metabolic syndrome to a large extent are corrected, and a lot of both human and experimental data to suggest this. So there's a very good correlation with that. And finally, I think the most important hormone seems to be CCK. CCK, which is again from the second part of the duodenum. Injecting CCK in animals can dramatically decrease intake of food. We can't do this in humans because it produces lots of nausea and vomiting. And all these duodenal ablation techniques seem to have some effect on CCK. Decreasing CCK or increasing CCK can actually change the energy metabolism. So I think there's a host of mechanisms here. So all this interact together. And we as endoscopists have the ability to actually modulate this completely. We know that there are other influences which are coming directly from the hypothalamus, and like Shiva showed very nicely the circadian rhythm affecting it, or like Setu showed about genetics. There are other influences coming in, but from the stomach in to the hindbrain, from the duodenum to the hindbrain, it is predominantly short-term weight that is actually modulated by this. Long-term weight has a more complex phenomenon. So thank you for your attention. We'll go on to the discussion.
Right. No, I think, thank you very much. I think I'd like to ask the organizers, since we are running late, how much time do we have for the question and answers? Because we have had a series of wonderful talks which have given us completely novel insights for many of us who are focusing on hardcore clinical work to understand the pathogenesis of obesity. Obviously, a discussion, there are questions that have arisen, and if we can get started, Dr. Anil, Dr. Ashish, how much time would you like to devote for the Q&A?
We have 15-20 minutes easily for discussion.
Thank you. Dr. Reddy sir, I think we missed having your talk completely. So before we move off this topic, probably you could kindly, everybody is looking towards the endoscopist as having possibly an intervention that they can offer that may fundamentally change the paradigm. See, as Setu's initial slides showed, the evolution of the present genetic makeup of the human animal has taken millions of years. And the obesity epidemic can be traced to the onset of the industrial era, which is maybe about 250, 300 years. So which is a really minute time and ahead of us, how genetic changes will happen is difficult to foresee. So till that happens, behavioral modification is equally difficult. The exercise pill that Dr. Ganini spoke about, and particularly metabolic endoscopy. What do you see as the future of metabolic endoscopy? What all are the procedures covered under this rubric? And is it really going to be a game changer in our time?
No, I think there are actually two aspects here that we clear about. Most of the weight-related procedures are done. Procedures related to metabolic activities are done in the duodenum separate. There's also some evidence to suggest that you can actually combine both the stomach procedures and the duodenal procedures to deal both with the metabolic and with your obesity. Very clear now is that the weight-related procedures, which are laparoscopically, are being rapidly replaced by endoscopic procedures. And the recent very good comparative study comparing laparoscopy with endoscopy published in CGH 5-year study, we showed equal efficacy of endoscopy, which is less invasive. And I believe that over a period of time, endoscopy will start replacing laparoscopy. Now, coming to the duodenum, this is where we as endoscopists have an access which surgeons don't have, or they'll have to have more invasive access. There are some very interesting data coming up where the duodenal mucosal ablation is being done by simplified procedures, of which electroporation is the most effective. Anybody can just put a system down to the duodenum and using the technique of ablation, completely ablate the duodenal mucosa very uniformly. And this, we have evidence before that over a period of at least 1 year, alters the metabolic activities and insulin resistance comes down. We have had some experience with certain sleeve, which we exploited in our department. We have seen that over a period of 2 years after putting the sleeve, your insulin resistance comes down, diabetic control is truncal obesity comes, and crash is reversed in some of the patients.
Right. Thank you very much. I think that's a very valuable, an element that we are all looking forward to, and probably in the near future, as more data emerges, the services of the endoscopists are probably going to be used more and more in this area, and maybe one of the more effective methods of tackling the ongoing pandemic of obesity. I think I'll request all the other panelists also to chip in with their inputs and their questions as we move along.
Can I make a comment, Saraswat? Can I make?
A quick one, please. I think we have short of time and there are a few questions to go through with the others. Yes, please, Setu.
Yeah, there was an observation in the last 1 year, ever since DMR came as a practice. Those people who had a GJ when I was a student, they all look now, they never become obese. Maybe this is a very interesting observation, so that a simple GJ which bypasses duodenum could actually be one of the methods, though it's cruel and or crude to do a GJ. I don't know how bad it is.
Yeah, just to add to that, there are some. One of the problems with pure GJ is the food is still going into the duodenum. So enough food is still going. So GJ is effective only in some patients, not in all the patients. But there have been very elegant experiments showing that if we do GJ and tie off the pylorus completely, so no food enters into the duodenum, then the effects are very good. So I think that is more important. That is partial gastrectomy with GJ is better than only a GJ.
I think you will put 2 clips to the duodenum and then do a GJ.
Yes.
Well, okay, these are good and useful insights. I think, Dr. Kharduri, we had a very novel input here that in manipulating, using ionophores to manipulate something as fundamental as the functioning of the mitochondria with the electron transport chain may help us better in energy generation. But this is a very fundamental intervention occurring at the level which basically some evolutionary biologists have thought that was the incorporation of this probe that eventually became our organelle or the mitochondria. And it is fundamental to the functioning of the life and functioning of almost all cells in the human body. So don't you think that any intervention is going to interfere with the electron transport system may be fraught with a lot of potential of adverse side effects, not just to the liver, but to all energy consuming organs? So, what are your thoughts on that? And is this a reversible process, easily reversible by stopping the drug, or it can lead to long-lasting adverse effects at the molecular level? Dr. Kharduri?
You're muted, sir, Dr. Kharduri.
If you could unmute, please.
Hear me now?
Yeah,
yes,
we can hear you.
You or not?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. All right. No, it's completely reversible. Once you stop the DNP, the modified version, you can actually stop it totally. The process is completely reversible. And also you can target molecule to a particular site as well. For example, you can have a hepatocyte target, and which will work with the liver, and when also the gluconeogenesis, glucose breakdown, etc. is happening. And so you'll have all the effects that I mentioned in my slides. So it's the only problem at this time is that we have to make it available on a large scale and see if there is any long-term toxicity. This is, of course, an animal study that I described, but it has a precedence in 1930s and thereafter. It was used to treat obesity, but that was the dinitrophenol, the parent molecule. Toxicity limited its use. So it is a viable option. As a matter of fact, a very viable option, and it can be targeted to particular tissue. I just also wanted to make clear something, because when I mentioned insulin resistance, I was talking about primary insulin resistance. When you talk about other things interfering in insulin transduction, that's not primary insulin resistance. Simply, most of us have been sort of kind of brainwashed into that diabetes is all about insulin resistance as a primary factor, and that is not true because we have evidence to support the claim. Maybe some would do this.
Right.
Dr. Vivek, can I ask a question to Dr. Reddy?
I think just let me finish this discussion with Dr. Kharduri. So I think, you mentioned that the newer interventions with the reduced doses of the ionophores has come out about 5-6 years ago. So has there been further movement forward, and are we close to a drug that can enter clinical trials using the anticipation model?
As a matter of fact, there are ongoing studies, and that are primarily done in males, since they have the patent on this molecule, and therefore, I hope we'll have some more studies available. I know the primary investigator who's involved with it, and he has been telling me that they have interesting leads, but he wouldn't go beyond that because of there is some confidentiality he didn't want to be.
Right. So do you think this is going to be the exercise field that Daniel was talking about?
I don't know. We have talked about exercise skills and all that primarily coming from the West Coast. And they haven't really panned out because after a certain time, all the efforts come to naught. So there may be a limit on how much we can impose on the system. But I think if we shut the calorie, if we shut the energy drives everything else, I think that's more promising to these exercise fields that have been sort of thrown in the discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Kharduri. Yes, Dr. Anil, you had a question.
Yeah, and Dr. Reddy, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah. If you see, the bariatric surgery and endobariatric therapy have been in the go for almost 30 years. Why is it that our goalpost for assessment keeps changing from accommodation to enteron to duodenum now to mid-stomach? Is it that we are just, should be concentrating more on the pathways which take the signals from the stomach up into the hypothalamus via the hindbrain, rather than restricting and trying to figure out how do these, endoscopic manipulation will change the thing?
I think the complexities involved in how stomach and duodenum regulate food intake and energy balance is very complex. And only in recent years, or last 5 years, there's been understanding of this mechanism. Bariatric surgery started very early, even before we understood this. And what bariatric surgeons were doing was a bypass predominantly, and later a sleeve gastrectomy. They didn't have the physiology behind how this is effective. Only now we come to realize this. So now we're becoming more precise in terms of endoscopic therapies because we're targeting only those parts of the stomach and duodenum where there is evidence that there is some amount of thing that can be brought about. Most of the others thing you're talking about is the signals that go to the hindbrain and also to some extent to the arcuate ligament in the hypothalamus are chemical signals. For example, stomach also secretes leptin, stomach secretes ghrelin, and CCK will be secreted, and also GLP-1 or peptide YY. All these are chemical signals that are going directly to the brain. And these chemical signals cannot be altered by endoscopic therapy. So I think there are two components. A short-term weight gain or weight loss, which as endoscopists and surgeons we can modulate, and a long-term weight gain and weight loss, which is on more physiological way, which requires some sort of therapies which we still are not very good at, like therapies against leptin and so on. So therefore, I think if you look at even all the results, both endoscopic and bariatric, if you take after 5 years, most of the patients start putting on some amount of weight. After 10 years, a considerable number of patients put on weight. That's why we haven't achieved the long-term energy balance with this, because we're looking at very short-term mechanical factors at times.
Right. Thank you. So I think the need is to target multiple targets on the pathway of obesity, not just focus either on the stomach duodenum alone or on the hormonal aspect of the other. I think the therapy of obesity is very much in its infancy at the moment, and evolution is going to in this area is going to happen in the. I thought Dr. Ghanemi indicated that he has a question to ask. So if you could unmute yourself and ask the question, Dr. Abdul.
I have just a general question. Since can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
I have seen that most of the speakers are from India, so I have just a question about that. First would be, does the government of India have a specific policy again to treat obesity, maybe make sport or physical activity mandatory in schools, or maybe financing some diet programs? And the second question would be, is obesity in India considered as a disease, and would someone suffering from it and receiving treatment for obesity, would that be covered by health insurance in India? Thanks. Anyone, I think, or anyone can answer me.
So, Anil, would you like to take that on? Because very fundamental questions that Dr. Ganani has asked.
You see, with passage of time, endoscopic surgery has come to stay and is being reimbursed by the medical insurance companies. With passage of time, we did realize that obesity is a disease. It is not just a lifestyle enjoyment or something which occurs because of your own laxity in working and accidental lifestyle changes. It has its own social and medical components of derangements in metabolic syndrome and other components, so it's reimbursed. But there is a limit to which it gets reimbursed. So particular type of procedures do get reimbursed in India. As of now, the government of India is not rich enough to provide, the basic fundamental support for dietary programs for taking care of this. Because only yesterday we had a news item that India has the highest number of the people who cannot eat. So obesity is a far-fetched dream for the government as of now.
Yeah, so the short answer is that at present, no, there is no government program going on for targeting obesity. And again, obesity management, other than when for complications of obesity, why then bariatric surgery, yes, that might be reimbursed by private insurance programs, but otherwise obesity as a disease and obesity therapy being reimbursed is not on the ground, not happening in India. Right. Shiva, I think you told us a lot, and you got a lot of very nice insights into the circadian rhythm and how it works and its role in the development of obesity. You mentioned something about a study on melatonin, giving melatonin supplements had a beneficial effect. This was what a pharmacologic effect of melatonin, that several grams were used, regardless of the body's own metabolic melatonin levels and so, or was melatonin deficiency identified as a pathogenic factor?
No. In these patients with melatonin, there was no deficiency of melatonin that was measured. You gave melatonin in pharmacological supplement doses, as I showed one trial at 10 mg. Melatonin is safe in higher levels also. There are some experimental studies, even if 100 and 200 mg, it's really not associated with significant side effects. So these trials were as an intervention when you give supplementation of melatonin in order to try to synchronize these circadian cycles between your central and your peripheral clocks, and then you show that there has been improvement in the metabolic effects that I mentioned in those studies here, whether it be HbA1c, sugar, lipid profile, everything. And there has been a broad improvement in all metabolic parameters. Melatonin supplementation was tried.
Right. Okay. And I mean, how potent is this intervention in modulating the circadian rhythm? What is its components? Say you are effectively to get to an ideal circadian rhythm and change the timing of meals and other factors. How much of an effect would it have in managing obesity in an obese person? To get him to a normal circadian rhythm, will it make a significant difference, or it is probably a minor component?
No, I think all interventions we have to look at as to how they change the metabolism, and not just in terms of how many calories you're eating or how many calories you're burning. Even caloric restriction, I think, should be looked at its metabolic effects. What are the metabolic effects of caloric restriction? What are the metabolic effects of exercise? What are the metabolic effects of changes in components of the diet? Each component has different metabolic effects, and similarly, what are the metabolic effects of reversing chronodisruption? So once you're able to reverse chronodisruption optimally with synchronization of your sleep-wake cycles, time-restricted feeding, and then with all the intentions that I mentioned here, but no light at night and bright light in the morning as soon as you get up, if you're able to achieve all these, you are going to have metabolic benefits, including weight loss. So weight loss will be one of the metabolic benefits, and chrono-synchronization, reversal of chronodisruption, is an important component of your entire therapy, which includes caloric restriction for its metabolic benefits, exercise for its metabolic benefits, and the right kind of diet for its metabolic benefits.
Right. Thank you. I think all that you're emphasizing is that we need to move away from our current concept of medicine, that one medicine at a time must work in a system.
I mean, current society is really is accelerating the process for putting everybody at risk for obesity and metabolic syndrome. We have
Right.
to accept that, and probably in a post-corona world, we'll be able to achieve better synchronization of your circadian and your metabolic rhythms, because you have less commuting, you don't travel, you don't stay at home. Maybe this is going to be the new lifestyle that we have to be used to.
Right. Okay. Yeah, exactly. As I was driving at that, eventually tackling something as complex to real as obesity will mean tackling multiple things at the same time, rather than expecting one intervention to do the job, and that usual approach of science and cause and effect may not be the best way to go ahead with this. Right. I think Anil, you told us a lot about gut microbiota and about how obesity there's a particular microbiome, some phenotypes have been identified. Is there a similar work for the lean microbiota, gut microbiota in the gut? Can you kind of think of FMT to package the particular bugs that are dominant in the lean people with and use that for tackling obesity? Because we heard bugs cause obesity is better studied.
Yeah, you see, if you remember the final slide about the caveats of the which I contradictory studies to undo what I've already said in the present slides. In fact, there have been contradicting studies in terms of the prevalence and the type of the microbiota. There are different diversity in different situations, and whatever data has been presented in the germ-free thin mice, which are not equivalent to the obese fat people which we are used to seeing. So extrapolation of the data from the animals to the human beings still in its infancy, number one. Number two, we do not have consistent data which shows the difference in the firmicutes and the bacteroids in patients who are obese versus lean. And if we want to do FMT, I think it will be trying to put the cart ahead of the horse. It's too early to do that. First, we need to have the basic studies to show that is responsible.
Right.
Short chain fatty acids and bile acids and effects are agonists. But in terms of the actual bacteria, the type of the bacteria, whether they reside in the large or the small intestine, I think we are still far away from the clinical applications. So it's too early to think of FMT. We need to have both more of basic science first.
Right. So, but gut microbiota appears to be a very attractive target. While as we gather and when we gather sufficient information, we might want to look at, because what can you modulate? Gene manipulation is unlikely to happen. The behavioral things you can, there are limitations. Endoscopic interventions and gut microbiota manipulation appear to be things that are within reach and within doable, always provided that scientific data justifying the intervention are generated. So I think you do see it as something towards which more work ought to be done, and more data needs to be generated. You are skeptical of that microbiota manipulation playing a future
As of
role in.
now, I'm just skeptical, and because the diet itself changes the microbiota. Microbiota has a differences in terms of your appetite and satiety. We do not know whether it is a small bowel or a large bowel microbiota which is responsible for metabolic disturbances or causation of obesity. I think at the moment it is too premature to think of things like FMT. We need to have more scientific basic data to see the effect, because it is a complex relationship. Because even in bariatric surgery, it is said that it leads to change in the microbiota, which is responsible for weight loss.
Right. So it might be more an effect rather than the cause, and I think far more work is needed before it reaches the level of a therapeutic intervention. Well, I think Dr. Setu Babu, you talked to us about the genes and the behavior and their role in the development of obesity. We are all familiar with substance abuse genes, and there's a lot of work and GWAS studies have been done that tell you what are the genes that predispose the serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SNPs in those genes that inhibit, that are responsible for dependence phenotype, whether it be alcoholism or substance abuse. Do you think there is some such addiction or dependence factor also in those who have obesity, who keep overeating despite having adequate calorie and not being able to sense satiety? And diseases like anorexia nervosa, bulimia, would they be the flip side of is there a genetic component there? So what are your thoughts on addiction to eating and the other
And I think I think if you want to define obesity, it would be a polygenic, multifactorial, and inflammatory condition with a lot of targets involved. The hypothalamus being one of the center which controls the satiety and appetite. Stress, for example, has been found to be a very important one. And for everything on the background, we have some gene or other which is found with multiple SNPs which are found common in all these areas. Could be a determinant factor as it is for this. But one observation very important is hardly 1/4 to 1/3 has a genetic influence. I think the environment makes much more important. And for example, as somebody pointed out during COVID season, people became obese. Could be may not be genetic then, and we also have data which says COVID susceptibility or COVID severity could be genetic. I think for everything we need to have some kind of correlation. Answering your question straightforward, there are two important points that genetics makes some disease severity, and manipulation of the genetics probably would be our interest. While we are looking at endoscopy, gut microbiome, probably can we have some hold on genetics that, there are drugs which have been targeted which can modulate, like I was talking about MC4R targeted drugs which are there, which could probably reduce obesity. Maybe that direction would be interesting. About gut microbiome, there seems to be a specificity. There are published this year articles on NASH itself has a specific microbiome, and alcoholic hepatitis has a specific microbiome. I think while cause and effect is being debated, gut microbiome has some implications. However, we do not have a very good study which says probiotics can bring down the obesity.
Well, I think Dr. Anil, Dr. Ashish, if you have any more questions or queries for the panelists, I think we have had a very wonderful evening with a lot of basic learning happening. And I think I hand over the proceedings to both of you for the concluding remarks.
Dr. Siva, I had one question. This was regarding the Jain type of feeding, what Dr. Saraswat also mentioned, that after sunset, if you don't eat. So, is there any evidence that that it can be used as therapeutic purposes, especially like sometimes intermittent fasting, where hourly fasting is there 16/8?
No, no, certainly. That is what I mentioned as time-restricted feeding, and time-restricted feeding coinciding with your sleep-wake cycle. That is when you're giving the longest gap between the evening meal and the morning meal, shortening the daytime feeding window, basically. A normal feeding window is 12 to 13 hours, let's say 8 a.m. breakfast, 8 p.m. dinner. And if you're able to reduce that to less than 10 hours, even 8 hours, then definitely it is associated with significant metabolic benefits. That I think there is clear-cut evidence. I mean, we call it Jain or any other variety, but basically reducing the feeding window to about 8 to 10 hours, this is associated with clear-cut metabolic benefits. And I think that it's a question of how practical and how much easy it is to implement in a social setting.
Right.
So Dr. Arun?
Yeah, a final question to Dr. Reddy. Recently, can you hear me, sir?
Yeah.
Dr. Pankaj Pasricha, in his recent talk on innovation endoscopy, did talk of a pill which, when you swallow, gives you microfilm which goes and coat the duodenal mucosa.
Yeah.
It is a synthetic pill. Do you think that can be an alternative to DNR?
No, actually, Pankaj and Ashish, his colleague together, have done a lot of work on this. It's a glycopolypeptide which goes and gets stuck to the duodenal mucosal cells there, inhibiting absorption of fluid. Most of the work which has been done, published in Nature, has been animal models. They have started a human trial, but the initial thing seems to be not so good as we expected. The assumption here was that it goes gets stuck, and then after a few hours it gets washed away, and then we are supposed to be free from these influences of this hormone. But unfortunately, although theoretically it looks very good, we still don't have human data to suggest that it was effective. So, and then plus for before every meal to take a pill and then to wait, and it's not also practical, I think.
Okay. So, any other comment from the expert panel?
Yeah, I'd just like to make one remark about the genetic aspect. So, I think you can also corroborate on this. Basically, one observation is in twin studies. So, if you have identical twins who are reared apart, who are genetically identical, but they've been brought up in different environments, and you have fraternal twins who are fraternal twins, but in the same they are living in the same environment, you find that there's greater concordance of BMI in the identical twins living apart versus the fraternal twins living together. So I think that if you look at various twin studies also, that will tell you how much importance genetics is in relation to the environment. So it's always a balance between the two, but twin studies also gives us some insights. Setu, you're unmute.
I think when you talk about genetics, we also talk about penetrance and influence of the gene and the environment. I think these are all going to be put together before we say that only one has caused the real influence on the disease. So genetics is one part actually, but it has its own importance even in familial studies. And if both parents are obese, the children tend to be obese. Again, the environment plays an important role. Anil, I think.
Well, I think we need to
Able to hear me?
participants.
Are you able to hear me?
Dr. Anil?
Yes, we can, Dr. Kharduri.
Yes. See, we have these people, these Mexicans who live in Texas along the Rio Grande Valley. Half of them, they're related by family, their genes are almost identical. The half that lives on the Mexican side is not obese. The half that lives on the American side are obese, same genes. The difference is the guy from Mexico, he doesn't drive to grocery store, he walks. The guy on the US side, he takes a car, even if it's 2 blocks. So you have the same gene but different environment, and then a huge difference between the two, suggesting that yes, genes are important, but we also make a fundamental mistake when we talk about genes. It's not only about the genes that are expressed. You also need to find out what are the genes that ordinarily repress those genes, whether there is a release of these repressors. And that is not being studied in most of the studies that have been done so far. And the genes also change, expression changes. You don't go to bed with the same genes expressed that you wake up with in the morning. This is something that has been realized now. That genes expressed in good matter with time, like somebody mentioned, but also with activity and some that you may be exposed to medications. So it's very complex to dissect. But I think the Taramura Indians that I described who live is a classical example that the environment plays a dominant role.
If there are no more questions, I take this opportunity to thank all the speakers and the learned panelists for their excellent discussion. Knowing very well that when you want to unravel the mystery of a complex disease called obesity, you may have to start from the intestinal and the stomach and duodenal lumen, go to the microbiome, look at the permeability, the various pathways which take it to the major metabolic organs like fat and the pancreas, and finally settling with central nervous system. It is a complex process in which we are just trying to find a needle in the haystack. But this is just the beginning, and I'm sure we are going to make headway. We have good discussion and with the repeated sessions on obesity which we are conducting regularly. With that, I'm extremely thankful for all of you for taking your time for this wonderful presentation, and I'm also equally thankful to the audience who have participated. Just to tell you that with the excellent faculty, we have about 1,000 people who had already registered and attended the webinar. I'm thankful to the technical support of the webcast and the pharma support by the pharmaceutical. A special thanks to Dr. Vivek and Dr. S.P. Singh, Dr. Ashish and Mandeep for having joined us with the presentation. Thank you so much. Good night and goodbye.
Goodbye.